Hi guys, tonight we begin a long and winding journey into the dusty heart of the American frontier, a place steeped in silence and smoke, where the slow creak of swinging saloon doors was the overture to countless whispered stories. Our tale is not just of gunfights and gold, but of something softer, more intimate, a taste, a smell, the daily rituals that grounded rough men and weary women in the midst of wilderness. We'll be exploring what food was served at Wild West Saloons, not as a list, but as a lived experience. Across 24 long and soothing parts, we'll step through the kitchens, lean across weathered bar tops, and listen in on quiet meals after long rides. So settle in, close your eyes if you wish, and let the prairie winds carry you back to a time where hunger shaped survival and meals whispered of who we were. The first light of dawn seeped over the high, windswept plains like a careful hand drawing a pale curtain. In a quiet town whose name had already started to fade from maps, a narrow trail of smoke curled up from the chimney of a squat building with flaking red paint and a wooden sign that squeaked ever so slightly in the wind. The saloon. Its name had once been the Silver Dray, but the paint had chipped away so thoroughly that only the first and last letters remained visible. Locals simply called it the Dray, or Sam's, after the man who had bought it 2 years after the railroad came through and the miners flooded the town. Inside, it was still. The tables had been wiped down with a cloth soaked in whiskey and water the night before, and the scent of the spirit still lingered faintly in the air, mingling with smoke and old grease. Near the back, a door opened slowly, and out stepped a woman wrapped in a rough apron, hair tied back in a low, loose knot. Her name was Letty Cole, and she'd been working that kitchen since she was 17. Letty lit the stove with a practiced hand, feeding it thin sticks of kindling, coaxing the flames until they caught on the larger logs. She moved quietly, almost reverently, as though this ritual were a kind of morning prayer. Once the fire had a voice of its own, she set to work, reaching for the sacks of flour and cornmeal in the pantry. The first meal of the day was never elaborate. Most men who came in before sunup were miners, ranch hands, or cowboys passing through, and they wanted something to fill the belly quick and cheap. Letty mixed the flour with a pinch of salt and a spoonful of lard, stirring it with well water until it held together. She formed the dough into small round biscuits and placed them into a cast-iron skillet already warming over the fire. The heat hissed softly as it kissed the iron. While the biscuits baked, she set a pot of beans to simmer. Navy beans, soaked overnight and flavoured with a hunk of salt pork left over from the previous week's delivery. Meat didn't always make it in time, and sometimes it didn't make it at all. But salt pork lasted, and for those who lived on the edge of the world, that mattered more than flavour. By the time the first customer pushed open the door, a drover named Clay, with a weathered hat and eyes too tired for a man so young, the smell of warm bread and pork-fat beans was already thick in the room. Letty didn't say much. She just nodded and placed a tin plate in front of him, then poured a mug of black coffee from a dented kettle she'd boiled on the back stove. Clay didn't speak either. He took a bite, chewed slowly, eyes staring out the window toward the rising sun. The biscuit was dry, a bit tough on the edges, but it filled his mouth with warmth. The beans were soft and salty, and he washed them down with the bitter, gritty coffee that Letty brewed from grounds reused one too many times. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes. Another rider passed by, and Letty moved to set another place. The saloon would stay quiet for a few more hours until the gamblers and drunks rose from their cots upstairs, but in these early moments, there was a peace that settled over the place like dust on a saddle. Letty sometimes thought about leaving. She had a sister in Kansas, married to a storekeeper who wrote proper letters and sent photographs. But there was something about the rhythm of the kitchen, the way the fire warmed her hands in the morning, the way the men nodded their thanks without speaking. It was a language she had learned to speak without ever opening her mouth. As the morning wore on, more men came. Some were familiar, others just passing through. One asked for eggs, and Letty shook her head. "Chicken's gone broody again," she murmured. "No eggs till she's done sitting." He grunted and took the beans instead. By mid-morning, a tall, rail-thin man with a broken nose and a scar on his chin came in with a younger boy. They looked alike, father and son, perhaps. The boy couldn't have been more than 12, with wide eyes that took in everything at once. Letty gave them each a biscuit and spoonful of beans, then added a drizzle of molasses from a jar she kept hidden behind the flour sacks. The boy lit up at the sweetness, smiling for the first time since they'd walked in. His father nodded once in Letty's direction. It was the kind of nod that said more than words could manage. Later, Letty would take what was left of the dough and fry it in lard until it turned golden brown, crisp on the edges. She'd sprinkle it with sugar if there was any to spare, or serve it plain with more molasses. The miners liked it that way. It reminded them of home. Outside, the town came to life in fits and starts. Horses clopped down the muddy main road. A man shouted something in Spanish near the blacksmith's shop. Somewhere, a harmonica played a lazy tune that drifted in and out with the breeze. Inside the dray, the food kept coming, plate after plate, simple and hearty. There were no menus, no choices. You ate what there was, or you didn't eat at all. Letty wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside for a moment, the sun just climbing high enough to warm her face. She looked out at the horizon, where the land stretched so far it seemed to disappear. It was a hard place, a hungry place. But here, in the quiet hum of fire and flour, beans and biscuits, there was something steady, something that held. And in that stillness, the day moved on, slow and certain, like the hands that stirred the pot and shaped the dough, just like always. By the time the sun had cleared the rooftops and begun to beat down in earnest, the saloon's morning hush had lifted. The dray was no longer quiet, but not yet loud, filled with the clatter of plates, the scrape of chairs against warped floorboards, and the low murmur of voices that rarely rose above the comfort of familiarity. The smell of coffee and pork fat still lingered, but it was joined now by a faint note of dried herbs, something Letty had steeped in hot water for her own sore throat. She kept a jar of mint and yarrow behind the stove, bundled tight in linen and tied with twine, gifts from an old Mexican woman who passed through last winter with her grandson. In a corner of the saloon, a man named Rafe Delaney sat with his boots propped on an overturned barrel. He was one of the regulars, not a rancher, not a miner, not really anything at all these days. Once, he'd driven cattle all the way from Abilene to Santa Fe, and before that, they said he rode with Quantrill's raiders, though no one ever asked him directly. His beard had gone mostly grey, and his fingers curled strangely from an old injury, but he still walked with a kind of slow grace that told of years in the saddle. That morning, he picked at a plate of cornbread and boiled potatoes, spooning thick brown gravy over the top. The gravy had been made from bacon drippings and flour browned slowly in a pan, thin but flavourful, spiced with black pepper and a little onion, when there was onion to spare. Letty had prepared the cornbread in the same skillet she used for biscuits, the batter made from stone-ground cornmeal, buttermilk, and a dash of soda. The crust had crisped along the edge where the iron met the fire, and though the middle was dense and crumbly, it held its shape well enough to mop up gravy. Some mornings the cornbread was served with sorghum molasses. Other days, like this one, it was paired with potatoes. An easier sell when the barrels were full and the meat supply ran low. At another table, a pair of men in wide-brimmed hats hunched over bowls of stew. One wore a military jacket with the buttons missing. The other had the look of a gambler, his fingers stained with ink and tobacco. The stew was thick and dark, filled with chunks of salted beef that had been soaked and simmered to soften them, and root vegetables scrounged from the last market wagon to come through town. Carrots, if you were lucky. Turnips, more likely. Always potatoes. The base was built from leftover coffee, a trick Letty had learned from an old cavalry cook. Dark roast mixed with water and thickened with flour, sometimes with a splash of whiskey if the bottle was already open. It added a smoky depth to the stew that kept men coming back for more, even when the meat was tough and the vegetables mealy. Over near the bar, Sam himself polished glasses with a linen rag that had seen better days. His eyes flicked across the room, taking in each customer, weighing each face. He didn't talk much unless he needed to, but everyone knew Sam ran a tight house. There were rules posted behind the bar. No fighting, no cheating, no credit. And if a man didn't like the food, he was free to find another saloon. Of course, There wasn't one within 30 miles, and everyone knew it. Midday brought a heat that pressed itself against the walls like a living thing. The dray's windows were cracked open to let the breeze through, but it brought more dust than comfort. Flies hovered lazily near the pantry, and Letty swatted at them with a damp cloth between stirring pots. She didn't mind the heat so much. What bothered her more was the silence that came with it, the way it pressed down between words and turned the air thick with thought. On days like this, people seemed to chew slower, speak softer, as if conserving their strength for the night to come. There was always a meal served at noon, though the line between breakfast and lunch blurred in a place like this. For many, it was their second visit that day, and they greeted their bowls or plates with a familiar nod, not expecting anything new. Most meals followed a simple rhythm: starch, beans, and a scrap of meat if luck held. That day, Letty had a bit of rabbit to work with, snared just outside of town by a boy who traded it for a slice of sweet bread and a coin. She stewed it down with wild onions and dandelion greens, the broth rich but thin, stretched to feed as many mouths as possible. A man named Ezra came in around 1 o'clock. He was tall and broad, with soot-stained hands and a permanent squint from working near the forge. Ezra was a blacksmith, or as close to one as this town could claim, and he sat down with a groan that rattled the chair beneath him. Letty brought him a bowl of beans and a wedge of pan-fried cornbread, and he gave her a tired smile in return. He always asked for hot sauce if there was any. Most days there wasn't. That day, she brought out a jar from under the counter, peppers pickled in vinegar and left to sit through 3 moons. He dabbed it carefully over his plate, savouring each bite as if it were a luxury. And in a way, it was. No one asked for dessert, not really. It wasn't expected. But sometimes Letty made apple pie if she could get her hands on apples from the eastern farms. She'd dice them small to stretch the filling, cook them down with brown sugar, and add a pinch of cinnamon if the spice tin hadn't run out. She used lard in the crust, rolling it thin with a bottle of whiskey in place of a rolling pin. When she served it, the men went quiet, not out of reverence, but because they were busy eating. That day there was no pie, but there was coffee, always coffee, and one last pot of beans warming over the back flame. Letty stirred it slowly, scraping the bottom with a wooden spoon to keep it from burning. A few more men drifted in, boots dragging, hats in hand. One of them had a nosebleed and a blackened eye, signs of a scuffle from somewhere down by the creek. Sam didn't ask questions. He just poured whiskey into 2 glasses and slid them across the counter. The kitchen was warm now, the kind of warmth that made your shirt stick to your back and your arms itch with sweat. Letty took a moment to lean against the counter, breathing slow, eyes closed. She could hear the murmur of voices through the wall, the low rhythm of spoons scraping bowls and mugs setting down on wood. It was the same as yesterday, the same as tomorrow would be. The food was never fancy. It wasn't meant to be. It was survival, plated and portioned and passed across a worn countertop to men who'd ridden long miles, worked long hours, or simply drifted in from nowhere. And though it was humble, it was steady. It was known. And sometimes, in a place like this, that was enough. The evening crept in slowly, dragging long shadows across the wooden floorboards of the dray. Outside, the air had shifted, cooler now, with the scent of dry grass and distant smoke carried on a restless wind. Horses snorted and stamped in the hitching posts out front, and the dirt road that ran through the centre of town bore fresh tracks from wagon wheels and boots alike. The day's work was done for most, and what remained was the ache in their bones and the quiet hope of a warm meal before night took hold. Letty lit the oil lamps one by one, their glow catching the edges of dust in the air, casting a golden hue across the saloon's rough-hewn walls. The stove was still hot, and the kitchen held the scent of slow-cooked beans, fried fat, and the faint sweetness of something baking. Tonight, Letty had decided to make her version of sourdough flapjacks, thick, slightly tangy cakes that browned up crisp on the griddle, served with whatever could be spared from the pantry. She ladled batter onto the iron and watched it bubble, flipping each cake with care. There was no maple syrup in the saloon, not in months, but there was sorghum, dark and thick and sharp sweet on the tongue. She poured a little into a tin pitcher and set it near the flapjacks, offering it up with a small nod to those who asked. A card game had already begun near the back table, 4 men leaning over dog-eared decks and crumpled bills. Their voices were low, occasionally punctuated by short bursts of laughter or the sharp clack of coins dropped too hard on the table. One of them, Jeb Whitaker, a wiry man with hands like twigs and a voice like sand, waved Letty over. "Got any meat tonight, Let?" he asked, voice rough from too many cigars and too little water. Letty hesitated. "Got a little ham," she said. "Boiled it with cabbage. Not much, but enough for a plate." Jeb grinned, showing a missing tooth. "I'll take it. Ain't had ham since the last mail wagon made it in one piece." She dished him a generous scoop, laying the pale, tender cabbage over the slice of boiled ham. The meat had been dry when it arrived, but she'd soaked it overnight and boiled it slow with caraway seeds and onions. It was the sort of meal meant to remind men of home, though few could say exactly where that was anymore. In the far corner, the piano stood silent. Dust had gathered between its keys. No one had played it in weeks, not since the last man with music in his fingers rode west in search of silver and never came back. But tonight, a stranger sat at the bench, young, lean, with hair slicked back and eyes too sharp for his age. He cracked his knuckles and placed his fingers on the keys like he was greeting an old friend. The first notes were slow, hesitant, then smoother as the melody took hold. It was an old tune, haunting and slow, something from the hills back east. Conversations faltered. Forks paused mid-air. Letty stood still for a moment behind the bar, the warmth of the stove still clinging to her skin, and listened. The music flowed through the saloon like smoke, curling around each table, sliding under door frames and through floorboards. It was a song of loss, of things left behind. The kind of song that made men close their eyes without realizing it. In that moment, the food became more than fuel. It became memory. A man named Ellis, who worked the mail line up north, leaned over his bowl of beef stew and seemed to forget to eat. The stew had been thickened with flour and bits of barley, the beef nearly gone to string from the hours it had boiled. But it was warm, and it was real, and it had come from the hands of someone who cared enough to stir it, to season it, to taste it once before it reached the table. A girl from the boarding house, no older than 16, came in shyly near sunset. Letty gave her a bowl of corn chowder, thinner than it should have been, but rich with the last of the salt pork and a handful of dried herbs from the windowsill. The girl sat alone at the corner table, spoon in hand, eyes watching the stranger at the piano. Outside, the sound of boots on gravel announced more arrivals. 2 men entered, covered in trail dust, their faces unreadable. They said little, but nodded toward the bar. Letty poured them coffee and handed over plates of fried potatoes and leftover bread warmed over the flame. One of them took a long pull from the mug, eyes fixed on the stranger still playing. Night deepened. Oil lamps flickered against the dark. The saloon filled with the sound of clinking silverware, murmured talk, and the piano's patient song. Letty moved through it all like a shadow, placing plates, refilling mugs, wiping counters. The kitchen never truly rested. There was always another pot to stir, another pan to scrape, another man to feed, and when the music finally stopped, it left behind a silence heavy with gratitude. The stranger said nothing. He stood from the bench and nodded toward Sam behind the bar, then turned and walked out into the night. No one followed. No one asked his name. Letty stood at the doorway a moment, wiping her hands on her apron, watching the darkness where he'd vanished. The stove still burned behind her, casting a flickering light against the worn floor. The scent of cabbage and pork lingered in the air, mixed now with the faint bite of coffee grounds boiling down for the next pot. The tables would empty soon. Some would stumble upstairs to the rooms they rented by the week. Others would vanish into the night, their hunger sated for now. And Letty would clean. She'd scrub the pots, sweep the floors, bank the fire low. Then she'd sit for a moment alone in the hush that came after and eat what was left. Maybe a flapjack gone cold, maybe a crust of bread dipped in stew. And in that moment she'd feel it again, that quiet knowledge that in this forgotten corner of the West, where names faded and days bled together, there was still a place where people gathered, where meals were shared, and where the simplest food could still carry the weight of memory, warmth, and song. The morning after the music, The saloon felt different, though nothing had truly changed. The tables remained where they always were, scratched and scarred by years of elbows, dice, and spilled drink. The lanterns swayed ever so slightly in the breeze that crept in through the half-cracked windows, and the stove, already warm before the sun had risen, crackled with the same low voice it always had. Letty stood in the kitchen with her sleeves rolled to the elbows and her hair still damp from the basin wash. She was stirring a pot of mush, cornmeal simmered in water until it turned thick and smooth, salted lightly and served with a spoonful of lard or a splash of milk when fortune allowed. Today, she had milk. Old man Pritchard had left a tin pail at the back door, a peace offering after last week's shouting match about credit. She'd accepted it without a word. The mush wasn't glamorous. It was a poor man's breakfast, a filler. But it was warm, and when paired with a spoonful of molasses or the crusted end of last night's sourdough, it was enough to start the day with something in the belly. A soft knock at the side door startled her. Few used that entrance. Letty wiped her hands on her apron and cracked it open to find young Caleb Porter, his cheeks pink from the cold and his jacket 2 sizes too large. "Mama said you might take these," he said, holding out a bundle wrapped in old cloth. Inside were 2 rabbits, freshly skinned and cleaned, their bodies pale and soft like unfinished dolls. Letty looked at him a moment, then nodded. "You want flapjacks?" His eyes lit up. "Yes, ma'am." She set him near the stove and fixed a small plate, 1 flapjack, golden brown and crisp at the edges, with a drizzle of sorghum and half a slice of fried pork she'd been saving. Caleb ate slowly, politely, eyes fixed on the flame, while his boots swung just above the floorboards. He said nothing more, and Letty didn't press. Some children in town were loud with hunger, others quiet with it. Caleb was the quiet kind. By the time he left, his hands sticky and his mouth full of thank you, the saloon had begun to wake. Sam was at the bar again, wiping glasses with that same old rag, eyes narrowed as though he saw something far beyond the room. 2 gamblers had slept at their table, and one was groaning into his arms as Letty placed a tin cup of coffee beside him. The other blinked at her like he wasn't sure if he'd dreamt her. "Got eggs today?" he asked hoarsely. Letty shook her head. "Hen still ain't layin', try the mush." He grimaced, but took it. By mid-morning, the smell of rabbit stew was beginning to drift from the kitchen. Letty had dressed the meat in flour, browned it in bacon grease, then stewed it with onion, pepper, and a pinch of dried sage from the bundle tied to the rafter. She added a few wrinkled carrots from the bin and a splash of whiskey to sweeten the broth. It simmered slow, the flavours deepening as the fire worked its patient magic. A woman named Bess came in then, her apron streaked with flour and her dark hair tied in a kerchief. She ran the boarding house 3 doors down, and though she rarely ate at the dray, she came to barter. Today she brought half a loaf of raisin bread and a jar of green tomato pickles. "I got venison drying if you want to trade next week," she said, eyeing the pot. Letty nodded and handed her a bowl of stew in exchange. They sat for a moment at the counter, eating in companionable silence. Bess had calluses on her hands like a man, and a voice rough from years of shouting over other women's children. But her pickles were sharp and perfect, and Letty had never once found a hair in her bread. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and carrying with it the dust of the plains. A traveller came through around noon, his coat long and his face drawn, and Sam gave him the usual glance, a silent question, a measured welcome. He sat near the window, and Letty brought him stew and bread without asking. He nodded his thanks. Sometimes it was like that. A man came through, stayed long enough to eat and sleep, and was gone by dawn. No name, no history, just boots on wood and hunger in the eyes. The food gave them something to anchor to, if only for a while. Later that day, the beans were served again, these ones baked slowly in a cast-iron pot, flavoured with molasses, mustard, and bits of bacon rind. Letty had baked a loaf of soda bread to go with it, the crust dark and hearty, the inside soft and full of warmth. It was the kind of food that stayed with you. The kind that made the difference between a long ride feeling possible or unbearable. A boy named Jed, no older than 10, wandered in around 2. He was barefoot and dirty, but Letty knew him. His father drank too much and worked too little, and the boy often scrounged for scraps. She fixed him a bowl without comment, pressing a biscuit into his hand as he left. He didn't smile, but he held the biscuit like it was treasure. The hours passed in their quiet rhythm. Men came and went. Some ate slowly, savouring each bite. Others scarfed it down with a kind of panic. Letty never judged. Hunger was a language that needed no translation. Toward dusk, a few ranchers arrived, boots caked with mud, their eyes squinting from days spent under the open sky. They smelled of horse and sweat and wind, and they ordered whatever was hot. Letty served the rest of the rabbit stew and brought out the last of the baked beans, scraping the pot clean. One of them, a man with a crooked hat and a fresh scar above his cheek, took a bite and closed his eyes for a long moment. "Reminds me of home," he murmured. Letty said nothing. She just poured him a second helping and handed him a cloth to wipe his face. Night came slow, with a sky smeared in lavender and gold. The stove dimmed to embers and the kitchen quieted at last. Letty sat for a moment at the edge of the counter, sipping the last of the coffee gone cold. Her back aching, but her mind still. The rabbits had been well used. The bread had stretched far, the beans had comforted, and the hush that settled over the saloon was one of full bellies and weary hearts, ready to rest. And still, somewhere deep in the warmth of the kitchen, the memory of breakfast lingered, of flapjacks and children, of bartered jars and spoonfuls of stew, a kind of music all its own. The next morning, frost clung to the edges of the saloon's windows like lace woven by a patient ghost. The desert had turned cold in the night, sharp enough to sting the lungs of those who rose early. Inside the dray, however, warmth bloomed slowly, rising from the stove like breath from a slumbering beast. Letty had arrived before first light, her boots crunching on frost-bitten earth, apron folded beneath her coat, cheeks flushed with cold. She set the fire before even removing her gloves, coaxing it to life with bark and brittle twigs collected in a bundle from behind the kitchen. The wood caught quick, eager to burn, and she fed it with thicker logs until the heat began to fill the room in gentle waves. Breakfast that day would be simple, but not spare. Letty opened a sack of hominy grits, coarse, pale kernels that she poured into a pot of boiling water with a pinch of salt and a bit of bacon grease. She stirred with a steady hand, watching the mixture thicken into something hearty. Grits took time, and she was patient. They had fed soldiers and slaves alike, and now they fed cowboys and gamblers with the same silent devotion. From the pantry she pulled down a jar of preserves. Apple butter made late last fall when the trees had still borne fruit, a gift from a family that had since moved east to escape the drought. The thick, spiced spread was dark as molasses, and she warmed a small spoonful to serve alongside biscuits. The biscuits today were made with buttermilk she had coaxed from yesterday's milk, thickened in the cold and curled at the edge of sour. They rose higher than usual in the skillet, soft and golden, their tops brushed with lard to keep them tender. She baked them in 2 rounds, letting the first batch rest while she prepared the next. The scent of them filled the kitchen. Warmth, salt, and the memory of bread rising in safer homes. Sam entered from the back stairs with the sluggish gait of someone who hadn't slept well. He rubbed at his face, then made his way toward the coffee pot without a word. Letty handed him a mug as he passed, and he took it like a lifeline, standing by the window and staring at the frost outside. "Cold came early," he said at last. Letty nodded, folding her arms. "Be worse before it breaks." The first customer came in shivering, wrapped in a patched-up coat and dragging his boots across the floor. His name was Otis, a prospector with fingers stained grey from mercury and dust. Letty handed him a plate of grits, a biscuit, and poured a mug of coffee without asking. He thanked her with a nod, his hands shaking as he brought the food to his table. Soon, others followed. A pair of young cowhands, brothers judging by their faces, sat shoulder to shoulder and shared a plate of biscuits between them. Letty gave them a jar of apple butter and let them spoon it out themselves, careful not to look too long at the holes in their boots or the way they chewed slowly, as if unsure when the next meal would come. By mid-morning, the saloon was alive with a low hum of voices, the scrape of forks on tin, and the rhythmic pop of the fire in the stove. Outside, the frost had begun to melt under a pale sun, and puddles formed in the wagon ruts, shining like glass. Letty stood behind the counter, slicing the last of a ham hock she'd kept hidden for a special day. It had dried slightly at the edges, but the inside was still good, salty, pink and rich with flavour. She cut it thin, warmed the slices on a skillet and served them atop a pile of grits with a bit of pepper sauce dripped across the top. The men who got it ate quietly, as if not wanting to draw attention to their good fortune. In the corner, an old trapper named Malachi slumped against the wall, sipping weak coffee and chewing slowly. He carried a bundle of pelts tied with sinew, which he traded to Sam for a warm place to sit and whatever food was going spare. Letty gave him the ends of the ham, tucked into a biscuit and wrapped in paper so he could eat it with one hand. He looked at her with rheumy eyes, then bowed his head in thanks. The piano remained untouched that morning, its keys silent and white as bone. No one seemed inclined to play. The memory of the night's music still lingered, and silence held more reverence than sound. Toward noon, a commotion outside drew attention. A wagon stuck in the muddy rut, its wheels sunk deep, the driver shouting curses into the wind. A few men rose from their seats to help, stepping into the mud without a second thought, their shoulders bent to the task. Letty watched from the window as they heaved and grunted, finally rocking the wagon free. When they returned, soaked to the knees and breathing hard, she served them bowls of warm beans and soda bread, the last she had until tomorrow's bake. One of them, a boy with straw-blonde hair and dirt on his chin, held his bowl close to his face like it was a hearth. Letty leaned against the counter, stretching her back, eyes half closed. Her own meal sat untouched, a biscuit with apple butter and a small wedge of cheese growing warm in the kitchen's heat. She'd eat it later, after the rush. Outside, the wind picked up again. A dog barked somewhere down the street. The sun began its slow descent, shadows stretching across the saloon floor like dark water. The grits were nearly gone, the ham too. But the warmth in the room remained. It lingered in the way men sat back in their chairs with full bellies, in the quiet that followed a satisfying meal, in the rare comfort of a moment unburdened by cold or hunger. Letty washed her hands and tied the back of her apron again. There would be dinner to make soon. She already had plans for the last of the potatoes and the neck bone she'd salted 2 nights ago. There would be stew again, maybe with a bit of flatbread if the flour held out, and the saloon would fill once more. With hunger, yes, but also with memory. With the unspoken bond that formed between those who ate beside one another, quietly, gratefully, and without rush. That evening, the wind howled across the plains with a voice that seemed almost human, low, mournful, and full of old sorrow. It slipped through the narrow alleys between buildings, whistled beneath doors, and pressed against the windows of the dray as though it wanted in. Inside, the saloon was dimly lit, the lanterns swinging gently with every breath of the draught. A fire glowed steadily in the stove, the only thing that stood between the warmth of the room and the clawing chill outside. Letty moved through the kitchen with sleeves rolled high and a smear of flour across her wrist. She was making flatbread tonight, simple sturdy rounds cooked directly on a cast-iron griddle over flame. The dough was nothing but flour, water and salt, kneaded until smooth and left to rest just long enough to rise slightly. She didn't have yeast for leavening, and the sourdough starter had gone bad 2 days prior. But flatbread was forgiving. It browned quickly, bubbled in the middle, and held up well under gravy or stew. In the back of the pantry, she'd found a smoked neck bone wrapped in muslin, the last of a trade from a trapper who'd gone north toward Montana. The meat was minimal, but it carried flavour, deep and dark and smoky. She dropped it into a pot of water with the last of the onions and diced potatoes, stirring in a spoonful of bacon grease and a handful of dried greens. The stew it made was thin but comforting, with a smoky taste that lingered on the tongue. As it cooked, the smell drew the first of the dinner crowd. Ranch hands just come off the range, spurs still jangling as they shuffled across the floor. A pair of miners arrived soon after, their faces streaked with soot, hands still bearing the grime of iron and earth. Letty didn't speak to them beyond what was necessary. She set down bowls of stew, slices of flatbread, mugs of coffee, and let them be. The saloon was louder in the evenings, voices rising with the fire's heat, the tension of the day melting into clinking cups and muttered jokes. At the long table near the centre, 3 men played dominoes while they ate. One of them, A big fellow with a stained vest and hair like straw dipped his bread into the stew and chewed with a grunt of pleasure. "Ain't had nothing like this since Christmas," he said, though no one replied. It wasn't really a compliment, just a passing thought shared aloud, as though the food had reminded him of something too distant to touch. A woman named Mabel drifted in next. She wasn't from town exactly, but had lived on its edges for years. Some said she'd been a singer once, before a fever took her voice and left her with a whisper. She traded stories for meals sometimes, her words rasping like wind through dry reeds. Letty handed her a bowl without charge and motioned for her to sit near the stove. The stew had deepened by then, the potatoes soft, the onions melted into the broth. Letty added a pinch of black pepper and a touch of vinegar to sharpen the flavour. The flatbread went out in rounds, cut into wedges and wrapped in cloth to keep warm. She served each plate with care, watching the faces as they took their first bites. Most gave no reaction. But some, those who'd been cold too long or too far gone in hunger, closed their eyes for a moment, just a blink, as if the food had caught them off guard. Letty knew that look. She had worn it once, years ago, before she found her place in the dray. It wasn't about taste, not really. It was about the reminder that something good could still be made with what little was left. In the far corner, Sam poured shots of whiskey for two traders who'd come in from the southern road. They were quiet, cloaked in dust, and carried long knives at their hips. They didn't ask for stew, but Letty brought them each a plate anyway. One of them hesitated, then took a slow bite and nodded. "Better than pemmican," he muttered, wiping his beard with his sleeve. Children didn't usually come at night, but little Sadie Tompkins slipped in around dusk, her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes wide and cautious. Letty crouched beside her, handed her a folded piece of flatbread wrapped in paper, and sent her on her way. No words were exchanged. They weren't needed. Outside, the wind kept rising, battering the shutters. The fire hissed as Letty stoked it with more wood, watching the flames leap and settle. Her own plate sat untouched on the shelf, a corner of bread, a ladle of stew gone lukewarm. She'd eat it later, once the crowd thinned. By 8, the saloon was full, voices rising, laughter breaking through like sunlight. A man had taken to the piano again. Nothing like the night before, no slow dirge, just a bright stumbling tune that echoed with drink and cheer. Cards were shuffled, dice clattered, boots tapped in rhythm against the floor. Letty moved between tables, clearing empty plates, refilling cups, nodding at requests. The work was endless, but she welcomed it. The noise meant life, and in life there was always hunger. The stew pot grew low. The bread basket emptied. The fire burned on. Later, when the voices quieted and the lanterns dimmed, Letty sat alone near the back, sipping weak coffee and rubbing flour from her knuckles. She watched the dying embers flicker, casting shadows like dancers across the walls. Tonight, she thought, they'd eaten well. Not fancy, not full, but well enough to last another day, and in a place where time blurred and names were lost to wind, that was more than enough. The morning dawned slow and grey, its light filtered through a sky heavy with low-hanging clouds. The scent of moisture clung to the air, rain not yet fallen but promised. In towns like this one, rain was both blessing and trouble. It softened the ground for planting but turned the roads to treacherous mire, trapping wagons and weary horses alike. The dray, though, welcomed it. Rain kept men indoors, kept them near warmth and kept them hungry. Letty arrived early again, coat pulled tight against the wind, her hands tucked into woolen mitts worn thin by use. The night's chill had left a sheen of damp on the wooden floor, and she took a dry cloth to it before lighting the stove. Each morning followed a rhythm, like a song only she remembered. Wood stacked, fire coaxed, coffee brewed in the blackened kettle, and then the flour. She was down to her last barrel, tucked away in the corner beneath a sack of onions. It would stretch, if she measured carefully. Enough for today, perhaps tomorrow. After that, it depended on the next supply wagon, if it came. She scooped a measured amount into a bowl, added a bit of salt, and began kneading a dough for fried scones. Not the sweet kind, not the kind served with cream or jam. These were frontier scones, made from flour, lard and water, flattened and dropped into a pan of bubbling grease. They puffed quickly, browned on the edges, and crackled as they cooled. Eaten hot, they were crisp and comforting. Eaten cold, they were still better than going without. Beside the stove, a pot of beans from the night before still lingered, the flavour richer now, deepened by time and smoke. Letty stirred them back to life, added a splash of coffee and a spoon of molasses, and let them simmer. The first to enter was Jonah Fields, a cattleman with dust still in his hair and a limp that worsened in the cold. He ordered without speaking, tapping twice on the bar before settling at the same corner table he always chose. Letty served him a bowl of beans, 2 scones and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. He nodded once, and that was all. By the time the clock above the bar struck 8, its ticking barely audible over the stove's hum, 6 more had trickled in. 2 railway men with heavy boots and soot-streaked coats, an older woman named Dora who sold stitched linens from a basket, and young Ephraim, who delivered telegrams up and down the county line. For each, Letty served the same: scones hot from the pan, beans thick and sweet, coffee or tea depending on their mood. She didn't offer choice. Choice was a luxury they couldn't afford. Ephraim asked quietly if she had any sugar. She didn't. Not today. Maybe next week. Dora offered a lace kerchief in trade for another scone. Letty took it gently and tucked it into her apron pocket. The wind rose outside, stirring the signs along Main Street, whistling between cracks in the walls. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked, followed by the slamming of a barn door. The saloon's shutters rattled but held. By late morning, a group of wet, mud-slicked riders pushed through the doors, shaking off their coats and muttering curses under their breath. They'd come from the southern trail, caught in the early rain. Their horses were stabled behind the general store, and their eyes told of cold that bit deeper than it should. Letty brought out more scones, more beans, the last of the pork fat stirred into the pot for flavour. She added a dash of pepper, just enough to bring warmth to the throat. One of the men, a tall fellow with a stitched-up cheek and a voice like gravel, took a bite and grunted with satisfaction. "Not bad," he muttered. "Better than chewing boot leather." Letty didn't smile. She simply returned to the kitchen, wiping her hands as she passed the counter. Outside, the clouds grew darker. Rain had begun to patter against the windows, soft at first, then harder, until it drummed like fingers tapping a warning. A few townsfolk who'd meant only to pass through stayed longer, drawn by the warmth, the food, and the gentle refuge of the dray. At noon, Letty prepared what little meat she had left, scraps of salted beef, shaved thin and fried crisp, then folded into a pan of hot gravy. She poured it over split scones and served it like a feast. Men lowered their voices as they ate, the sound of rain muting everything but the scrape of knives on tin plates. No one asked what kind of meat it was. No one needed to. That afternoon, a small girl with a crooked braid and a coat 2 sizes too big sat by the window, watching the rain. She nibbled at a piece of fried bread Letty had slipped her without a word. Her boots dripped quietly beneath her chair. She said nothing, but stayed for hours, content just to be warm. Sam leaned on the bar, watching the girl with a rare softness in his gaze. "She got a home?" he asked. Letty shook her head. "Not a proper one." Sam poured a glass of milk from the jug behind the bar and set it down beside her without speaking. The day passed that way, slow, grey, filled with damp coats, steaming plates, and the hush of rain on wood. The food dwindled, but no one left hungry. And when the stove's heat began to fade and the scones turned stiff on the counter, Letty wiped down the kitchen and stared out the window at the sky. Still raining. Still no sign of the wagon. But for now, the dray stood steady, lit by oil and fire, fed by whatever could be spared. And Letty, tired, flour-dusted and silent, was already thinking of what could be made from the last potatoes, the onions that hadn't yet sprouted, and the secrets she kept in a jar behind the stove. That night, the rain did not stop. It fell in steady sheets, flattening the prairie grass and running in rivulets down the packed earth outside the dray. The street became a river of mud, slow-moving and deep, where wagon wheels sank and stayed. The wind picked up around midnight, slapping water against the windows like impatient hands. Inside, the saloon glowed amber and gold, a warm pocket stitched into the storm. Letty stood near the stove, her silhouette etched by firelight. She was chopping onions now, slowly, deliberately, her fingers moving with a rhythm that matched the rain. The knife made soft thuds on the cutting board as she worked. From the pot on the stove, steam curled upward, thick with the scent of broth and spice. Tonight, she was making a hash, a rough and ready kind of meal, built from whatever could be found. It began with diced potatoes, parboiled in salted water, then crisped in pork grease until their edges browned and popped. Into that she stirred the onions, then pieces of dried beef soaked in broth, and finally a spoonful of vinegar to sharpen it all. There were no fresh herbs, no cream, no flair, just salt, pepper, and the careful layering of heat and thyme. In the dining room, the lamps burned low, shadows rising tall against the walls. The tables were half full, cowhands, travellers stranded by the storm, and a few locals who knew better than to ride out in weather like this. They spoke in murmurs, their voices swallowed by the rain's endless hiss. At the corner table, old Elias Wheeler hunched over a plate of hash, his hands trembling slightly with age. He had once been a buffalo runner, long before the herds thinned and the rifles quieted. He rarely spoke now, but he came to the dray every Thursday night without fail. Tonight, Letty added an extra piece of bread to his plate. He noticed. He didn't say anything, but he paused before he ate, as if the gesture needed to be acknowledged in silence. A woman named Lorna entered next, shaking out her shawl at the door. She worked over at the livery, mucking out stalls and tending to the sick horses the others had given up on. Her hair was soaked, and her boots were caked in mud. Letty handed her a plate without a word, hot hash, a wedge of bread, and a cup of coffee so dark it looked like ink. Lorna took it all to the seat nearest the fire and sat with her shoulders hunched, steam rising from her skin. The piano was quiet tonight. No one played. The keys remained untouched, their surface slick with dust and the hush of the room. Instead, the rain was music enough, tapping out a rhythm that never faltered. Letty moved through the space like a shadow, silent and constant. She cleared empty dishes, poured more coffee, wiped crumbs from the counters. When the fire began to wane, she added more wood, stoking the heat until it reached the far corners of the room again. She thought of the potatoes. There were only a few left now, 2, maybe 3, softening at the ends. She'd need to cut the eyes out before they sprouted. Still, they'd do for another meal. There was a jar of pickled cabbage in the back, brined with mustard seeds and red pepper flakes. She turned it over in her hands, then set it on the shelf again. Not tonight. That was for leaner days. Around 9, a rider stumbled in, soaked to the skin and panting from the cold. His coat hung from his frame like dead weight, his boots squelching with every step. He was young, maybe 20, with a face darkened by stubble and eyes made sharp by hunger. He didn't ask for food. He didn't have to. Letty brought him a plate and set it down in front of him. Hash, bread, coffee. The heat rose to meet his face, and he leaned over it like a man come in from the edge of the world. He ate quickly, but not without care, chewing slowly enough to feel the warmth return to his bones. He nodded once at Letty as she passed, a small, grateful nod. She returned it with the faintest motion of her chin and then turned back to the stove. The room swelled and breathed with the storm, each person inside drawn closer by the common thread of cold and hunger. There were no grand conversations, no stories spun for entertainment. Just the sound of forks on tin, the scrape of boots on wood, and the wind's eternal whisper beyond the walls. By midnight, the crowd had thinned. Some had gone upstairs to the rented rooms, where threadbare quilts and straw mattresses awaited. Others braved the rain, holding coats above their heads, drawn homeward by habit or necessity. Letty stood alone in the kitchen once again, wiping her hands on a towel already stained with flour and grease. The last of the hash cooled in the pot. She ladled herself a small bowl and sat on the stool near the back door, where she could hear the storm more clearly. The rain played a lullaby on the rooftop, soft and steady. She ate slowly, chewing each bite with quiet thought. It was saltier than she intended, but good. The vinegar had cut through the fat, and the potatoes had browned just right. It wasn't much, but it was real. It was earned. Outside, the wind bent low, whispering secrets through the cracks in the wall. And inside, in that small corner of warmth and firelight, a woman finished her meal, fed the stove one last time, and waited for morning. By dawn, the rain had eased, leaving the town soaked and shivering under a blanket of pale fog. The earth was soft and bruised beneath boot soles, and puddles shimmered like pieces of broken glass between the boards of the porch outside the dray. Smoke curled lazily from the saloon's chimney, the fire inside still smouldering from the night before. Everything outside felt blurred, hushed, as if the storm had taken sound and sharpness with it. Inside, Letty moved slowly, the stiffness in her joints a quiet reminder of the night's labour. Her hands ached a little more these days, especially in the cold, but they never failed her. She cracked her knuckles once, then got to work. There wasn't much left. The pantry looked emptier than it had in months. 1 onion, a half sack of cornmeal, a slab of lard wrapped in linen, a jar of pickled cabbage, 2 small potatoes, soft at the eyes but still salvageable. She surveyed it all in silence, then set to boiling water over the fire, her thoughts already stirring. Breakfast would be hoe cakes. Nothing fancy, just cornmeal, salt, water and a spoonful of lard to keep them from sticking to the griddle. She worked the meal with her hands, feeling the grit of it between her fingers as she stirred. When it was thick enough to hold together, she dropped scoops onto the hot skillet and pressed them flat with the back of her spoon. They sizzled and spat, the scent rising to fill the room. While the cakes cooked, she peeled the potatoes, slicing away the sprouts and rot until only clean flesh remained. She diced them small and dropped them into a second pan with the last of the lard, letting them brown slowly. They'd go on the side, maybe with a little vinegar from the cabbage jar if someone asked. The door creaked open just after first light, and in came Paxton Grimm, a quiet man with a beard like dry moss and hands as wide as dinner plates. He didn't speak, only nodded, and Letty brought him a plate, 3 hoe cakes, a heap of fried potatoes and a cup of black coffee. He ate with both hands, chewing slow, his eyes fixed on the fog outside the window. More followed. The storm had driven travellers into town, and now the easing weather drew them back out again. They came in for one last meal before hitting the trail. Riders with wet boots and horses waiting in the mud, gamblers with their winnings hidden in coat linings, ranch hands with their pay tucked in boot soles. Letty served them all, one by one. She portioned the cornmeal with care, flattening each hoe cake with the same quiet precision, flipping them when the edges curled just right. The potatoes crisped to golden, and she sprinkled them with salt scraped from the bottom of the barrel. There was no meat today, and no one asked for it. They ate what was given, grateful for warmth, for coffee, for food that reminded them they still had teeth and stomachs. A preacher sat near the stove, his collar damp, his face flushed from a morning walk through the mud. He blessed his food before touching it, whispering something into his plate like it mattered. Letty watched him from the kitchen, then turned back to her skillet. The hoe cakes came out in batches, golden, steaming, dense but satisfying. She stacked them on chipped plates and drizzled the last of the sorghum over a few. The sweet dark syrup clung to the surface like ink, catching the light as it spread. Young Sadie returned too, her feet bare this time, her toes black with dirt. Letty handed her a hoe cake wrapped in a cloth, still warm from the griddle. The girl pressed it to her face before she ate, like it was something soft and sacred. Letty said nothing, just watched her go. Around 10, a man stumbled in with a twisted ankle and mud up to his knees. He cursed under his breath and asked for whiskey, but Sam refused him with a nod toward the kitchen. The man took a plate of hoe cakes instead, his hands shaking slightly as he held the fork. "You got any pepper?" he asked. Letty brought him vinegar. It was all she had. The morning wore on in this way. Forks scraped. Coffee boiled. Fog drifted past the windows like ghosts looking for names. And when the rush faded and the plates emptied, Letty finally made herself a meal. 1 hoe cake, a spoon of potatoes, and a smear of sorghum from the side of the jar. She sat on the step near the back door, the cold air biting at her cheeks, and ate slowly, watching the fog begin to lift. The earth smelled of wet wood and crushed grass, of soot and horses and cold iron. She breathed it in, steady and deep. There would be no deliveries today. The road was too wet, the wagons too heavy. She'd have to make do again tomorrow, maybe stew the cabbage with some vinegar, maybe boil cornmeal into mush for supper. But today, for a little while, the food had held. It had stretched. It had given shape to the morning. And inside, beyond the back door and the empty kitchen, the warmth still lingered. The smell of hoe cakes clung to the air. And the hush after the storm was thick with the quiet gratitude of the fed. By afternoon, the fog had burned away under a meek sun, revealing the muddied scars of wagon wheels and hoofprints carved deep into the earth. The saloon's porch sagged under the weight of wet boots left out to dry, and the wooden planks groaned when stepped on, waterlogged and softened by the storm. A pair of sparrows picked through the puddles near the trough, darting between broken stalks of grass, while farther off, someone was hammering something back into place, a roof shingle perhaps, or a fence rail torn loose by wind. Inside the dray, the light had changed. Golden now, stretched long across the tables, filtered through dusty windows. Letty moved quietly behind the bar, taking stock of what little she had left. The shelves were nearly bare. The pantry offered only fragments, an onion already beginning to sprout, a handful of dried beans, a crust of cornbread forgotten in a tin. She turned each over in her hands, weighing not just quantity but what could be made from so little. She decided on a bean soup. Simple but nourishing. She rinsed the beans carefully in a pan, picking out the pebbles and bits of chaff that always seemed to cling to them. They were small, white and firm, navy beans, or near enough. She soaked them in water and set them to boil, adding a bit of salt and what remained of a smoked rind she'd saved in the cool dark corner of the pantry. As the pot warmed, she diced the onion, slicing around the soft spots, then dropped it into the water. It hissed briefly, then settled into a slow rhythm as the soup began to simmer. With each pass of the spoon, the scent of smoke and earth began to fill the room. Mild, savoury, the kind of smell that clings to clothes and brings men inside from the cold. By 3 o'clock, the first to notice it was Rafe Delaney. He'd been sitting near the window, rolling a cigarette slowly between his fingers, watching the sky as if waiting for it to change its mind. He didn't say anything, just sniffed the air and raised his brow. Letty brought him a bowl when it was ready, thin broth, soft beans, bits of onion and smoke curling from the rim. She gave him a piece of fried bread on the side, reheated from the morning's batch. He dipped the edge of it into the soup, then leaned back in his chair as he ate, eyes half closed. Others followed. By late afternoon, word had passed quietly, from mouth to mouth and boot to boot, that there was hot soup at the dray. They came wet to the knees and tired in the eyes, rail workers, stable boys, a widow with her youngest wrapped in shawls. Letty ladled soup into whatever bowls she could find, filling cups when bowls ran short, tearing pieces of bread with her hands to share among them. No one complained. No one asked for more than they were given. They ate in silence, occasionally glancing toward the stove, where the pot continued to bubble softly. The woman with the baby sat near the fire. Letty gave her the thickest bowl she had and slipped a spoonful of pickled cabbage onto the side for strength. The child stirred, blinked once, then fell asleep again in her arms. Letty watched them for a moment, then turned back to her work. By sunset, the soup was nearly gone. The last few beans clung to the bottom of the pot, and the broth had turned pale from ladling. She scraped it clean, wiped her hands on her apron, and stepped outside for a breath. The air was crisp now, tinged with wood smoke and the faint promise of frost. The sun was dropping fast behind the hills, casting long orange shadows across the rooftops. Letty stood on the back step, rubbing her arms, and looked west. The food had stretched again, barely, but it had. Enough bowls to feed a room. Enough warmth to keep the cold outside a little longer. She was already thinking about tomorrow. The pickled cabbage could be fried, maybe with cornmeal and water to make a mash. There was one more jar of apple butter, hidden behind the coffee tins, and a pouch of dried berries so old they'd need to be soaked. Her mind turned these things over not with worry, yet but with focus. It was the same every day, count, combine, create. There was always something to be made, even if it wasn't much. From the front of the saloon, voices rose again, soft, steady, and full from the inside out. Letty stepped back into the kitchen. The fire was low now, glowing red beneath the ashes. She knelt, added a log, and watched the flames catch. Then she sat near it, her back against the wall, and rested her hands in her lap. The pot was empty. The bellies were full. The night would be long. But there was warmth. There was still a stove, and in the quiet after a shared meal, the world outside seemed for a while very far away. That night, a hard frost crept across the window panes, turning each one into a slow white bloom of ice. It spread from the corners like fingers seeking warmth and found none, clinging tight to the glass as if in mourning. Outside, the stars glittered sharp and clear, unclouded now that the storm had passed. The moon sat low on the horizon, watching in silence, casting silver light on the rooftops, on the frozen trough, and on the soft rise of the prairie beyond. Inside the dray, the fire had been coaxed into a steady blaze, crackling and spitting gently in its iron cradle. The stove gave off a comfortable heat, enough to chase the bite from the air, though not so much as to make one forget the season. Letty was still awake, sitting at the edge of the counter with a cloth draped across her lap, her fingers busy with the last of the dried berry pouch. She picked through them carefully, discarding the ones gone too hard, saving what she could. The kitchen was quiet. The pots were clean, the counters wiped. Only the faint tick of the wall clock and the fire's whisper marked the time. Letty soaked the salvageable berries in a bowl of warm water, letting them soften. Tomorrow, she'd mash them into a paste with what little sugar remained, spread it over corn mush and call it pudding. It wouldn't be sweet enough for a child, but it would be something. She stood, stretched her back, and walked to the pantry. There, hidden in the farthest corner, was the jar of apple butter. She had almost forgotten it. Her fingers brushed the cool glass, and she held it for a moment, listening to the stillness. There had been a man once, long ago now, who brought her apple butter in tins lined with cotton. He'd had a way of whistling through his teeth when he peeled apples, and his hands were always stained from peeling too fast. She hadn't thought of him in years. But now, holding the jar, she remembered his voice, low, drawling, full of lazy laughter. He'd died on a cattle drive, trampled in the dust between Amarillo and Fort Stockton. She never heard the details, only that he didn't come back. She put the jar on the shelf beside the coffee, then turned back to the stove. It was time to sleep. But sleep came slow to Letty these days, and the silence of the saloon was a kind of companion. The floor creaked under her boots as she crossed to the main room. Sam had gone to bed hours ago. The bar was dark. A few men remained upstairs, sleeping off whiskey and trail miles, their snores faint through the ceiling. Letty took a moment to sweep the hearth, then settled into a chair near the window. The frost had thickened. A sheet of it now, pale and perfect. She traced the edge of it with her finger, then pulled her shawl tighter. Her stomach ached with hunger, but she would not eat. Not tonight. There were too few supplies left, and tomorrow would bring mouths more in need than hers. Instead, she sat in the dim light, listening to the wind press against the saloon's walls, soft but persistent. The kind of wind that spoke of change, though she didn't know if it would be kind. Sometime in the night, footsteps echoed on the porch. Letty didn't move. She knew that sound. Boots too light to be drunk, too careful to be in a hurry. The door creaked open. A tall figure stepped inside, brushing snow from his coat. A beard like dusted charcoal, a face worn by travel. He paused when he saw her. "Evening," he said softly, voice hoarse. Letty nodded. "Cold out?" "Colder than the devil's handshake," he muttered. She rose without a word and returned to the kitchen. The pot was empty, but she scraped the last of the soup from the bottom, just enough for one small bowl. No bread left, but she warmed it all the same. When she brought it out to him, he looked at her like he didn't know what to say. Then he ate, slow and quiet, savouring each bite. When he was done, he placed the bowl on the counter and pulled out a coin. Letty shook her head. "Keep it. Next time, maybe." He didn't argue, just tipped his hat, then sat by the fire, eyes fixed on the flames. She watched him for a while, then turned down the lamps one by one. Shadows stretched long across the floor. The stove gave a last crackle. The man drifted to sleep in the chair, breath steady, boots thawing beside the hearth. And Letty returned to the kitchen, wrapped the soaked berries in cloth, and whispered a quiet prayer that the wagon would come tomorrow, that flour and salt and meat would cross that cold, wide plain and arrive in time. She didn't believe in miracles. But in the dray, on a frost-bitten night, hope often came dressed in flour, fire, and something warm in the bowl. Morning broke with a brittle clarity, the sky stretching vast and cloudless over the town, washed clean by the storm. Frost still clung to the ground in shaded corners, sparkling like crushed glass under the first touch of sunlight. Horses stamped softly in the chill, their breath pluming white. Somewhere in the hills, a coyote called once, then fell silent. Inside the dray, warmth still lingered from the night's fire. The coals had held, and Letty coaxed them back into life with practiced hands. She moved slowly this morning, her limbs stiff, her eyes shadowed. She hadn't slept. She rarely did when food was low. Instead, she'd passed the night turning over recipes in her mind, conjuring meals from scraps and hope, measuring distance by memory, how far the supply wagons might have made it, whether the rivers were still too swollen to cross. The soaked berries had softened some. She mashed them gently with the back of a spoon, stirring in the last pinch of brown sugar she had and a bit of flour to thicken it. Over the fire she heated water and added cornmeal, stirring slowly until it bubbled into a thick porridge. She folded the berries in last, swirling the dark paste through the golden mush. It wasn't a pudding, not truly, but it would do. She tasted it once. It was tart, earthy and faintly sweet. It was food. She ladled the first bowl and set it aside. The man who'd arrived in the night stirred awake near the fire. His coat had dried stiff, and his boots steamed faintly from where he'd left them close to the stove. He blinked slowly, as if unsure if he'd truly woken, then rubbed his face with both hands. Letty placed the bowl of cornmeal and berries on the table beside him. He looked at it for a long moment before eating. "Didn't think I'd get another warm meal so soon," he said softly. "Much obliged," she nodded. "You ride far?" He nodded. 3 days west of here. Crossed the Pecos just before the rain caught me." Letty knew what that meant. No dry trail, no dry bed, no other towns between. She simply returned to the kitchen and began preparing more bowls. By 7, the regulars had begun to arrive. Paxton first, then Ephraim with his telegram satchel, then 2 boys from the livery who tracked in mud and the scent of hay. Letty served them each the cornmeal mash, ladled in careful portions, always topped with the darkest swirl of berries she could stretch. There was no coffee left, not today. She steeped crushed dandelion root in hot water, poured it dark into mugs, and said nothing when the men noticed. It was bitter and sharp, but it warmed the hands just the same. Sadie came again, her braid looser this time, one shoe missing. Letty gave her a bowl and a cloth napkin, then slipped a dried apple slice into her hand from a hidden tin. The girl looked at it like treasure, then ran her fingers over the soft leathery skin before slipping it into her pocket. By mid-morning, the sun had melted most of the frost. Water dripped steadily from the roof. Boots dried on the porch rail. The scent of the cornmeal filled the air, warm, homey, clinging to the old wood of the saloon like it belonged. Letty scraped the pot for the last bowl and sat at the back step to eat. She used the same spoon she'd stirred with, the same tin bowl, still warm in her lap. The wind had calmed. The sun lit the yard in gentle gold. She listened to the birds pick at seeds near the trough and let the quiet wrap around her. The berries had softened more than she expected. Their flavour had deepened overnight, touched by the sugar, the fire, the hush of waiting. She chewed slowly, each bite grounding her in something real. There was nothing left now. No flour, no sugar, no cornmeal, no beans. Only the pickled cabbage, the apple butter, and whatever she could find in the root cellar beneath the floorboards. She heard wheels then. Faint at first, then louder. Then the unmistakable squeal of metal on wood, the rumble of hooves in wet soil. Letty stood, bowl still in hand. The wagon. She walked to the porch, eyes squinting against the sun, and watched as it turned down the street, its frame swaying, crates stacked high, canvas flapping. Behind it came a second cart, smaller, driven by a woman with a kerchief over her mouth and a rifle on the seat beside her. The relief didn't come as joy. It came as exhale, as weight loosening, as the small knowledge that today's hunger wouldn't stretch into tomorrow. She turned back into the kitchen, set her bowl down and began clearing the counter. There would be sacks to carry, shelves to restock, wood to split, meals to plan. But first she stoked the fire high again. She pulled out the iron pans. She filled the kettle with water, and she opened the jar of apple butter, because some things, sweet things, were meant to be shared on days when the world remembered to be kind. The wagon brought more than food. It brought voices, clamour, the sound of boots hurrying across wet boards, the scent of leather and tobacco, and travel sweat. It brought breath back into the saloon, like lungs long starved for air. And in that breath Letty moved with new purpose, sleeves rolled high, apron already streaked with flour by the time the last crate was unloaded. She didn't stop to speak much. She sorted quickly. Beans, flour, cornmeal, tins of molasses and syrup, dried apples, barrels of salt pork, cured meats wrapped in brown waxed cloth, a sack of rice, 2 jars of real coffee, a treasure trove. By mid-morning, the pantry was full again. Not abundant, but full. Enough to plan beyond one meal to imagine a supper while still cooking breakfast. She started with biscuits, buttermilk, lard, a pinch of soda, mixed just enough to hold, then rolled and cut and set into the hot cast-iron skillet. The smell filled the saloon in minutes, sharp and warm, like comfort with an edge. She basted the tops with bacon grease and slid them into the oven, checking them twice, listening for the faint sizzle as they rose. Then came the salt pork. Sliced thick, pan-fried until crisp at the edges, its fat rendering into a shallow pool that hissed and popped when it caught the flour from the biscuit board. Letty spooned off the grease into a small tin and added it to a fresh pan of beans, the same kind she had served before, but this time richer, deeper, kissed by smoke and the memory of meat. It didn't take long for the saloon to fill. Word moved faster than the wagons. Sam stood behind the bar once more, polishing glasses he'd set aside days ago, eyes scanning the tables like a man who knew he had something worth protecting again. Letty served plates with both hands now. Biscuits, pork, beans, black coffee that drew sighs from every man who tasted it. And with every plate down, the room leaned into its heartbeat again. Dice clicked. Boots tapped. Laughter, real laughter, threaded through the air like music. At one table, a woman named Alma poured syrup over her biscuits so slowly it was like she feared she'd wake from the dream. She'd come from the north, selling handmade dolls stitched from fabric scraps and twine. Her hands were always red from the cold, her knuckles cracked. But now she dipped each bite into her coffee like she used to when she lived in Arkansas, before the bad years. Letty noticed. She said nothing. Just brought her another biscuit when the plate ran low. Near the stove, little Sadie sat with both hands around a tin cup of warm milk, crust from her biscuit still clinging to her chin. Letty had sprinkled a bit of sugar on it, just enough to make her eyes light up. The child swung her legs under the chair, humming tunelessly, her face soft in the morning light. A man sat near the window, unfamiliar. He'd come with the wagon. Some sort of guard, Letty guessed, judging by the rifle strapped across his back and the way he watched the room. But he didn't eat like a man waiting for trouble. He ate like someone who hadn't tasted home in weeks. He closed his eyes with the first sip of coffee and didn't open them again until his plate was clean. By noon, the fire had turned hot and strong, chasing the last of the chill from the corners of the saloon. The windows steamed slightly. The smell of baking, frying, and steeped coffee wove together into something that felt almost holy. Letty stood behind the counter for a moment, looking out over the tables, the people, the flicker of light on silverware and the sound of boots scuffing against worn wood. Her hair had come loose in places, her sleeves were smudged, and flour dusted her neck. But her eyes were clear, her hands steady. She went back into the kitchen and fetched the apple butter. She spread it thick across the next batch of biscuits, warm, golden, fragrant with cinnamon and clove. She brought out a tray and walked table to table, offering them by hand. One man took his and looked up at her with something like awe. "Haven't tasted this since my mama passed," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Letty just nodded, moved on. She didn't need thanks. The food did the talking. Back in the kitchen, she had already begun soaking beans for supper. There'd be cornbread too, baked in the skillet, and she'd try her hand at rice with molasses and dried apples. Maybe a stew if she could stretch the pork. There was still vinegar, mustard, onions in crates beneath the stairs. For the first time in weeks, she had options. She stood by the pantry door and let the hum of voices in the saloon drift toward her. It wasn't loud, but it was full. The kind of sound that wrapped itself around the bones of a place, made it feel lived in, loved. The biscuits were gone. The beans nearly scraped clean. But there were more to come. The stove crackled. The fire warmed. and Letty Cole, with flour on her hands and apple butter in her heart, was already kneading dough for the next batch. As afternoon faded into the long shadow of early evening, the golden hue that had bathed the dray softened, slipping slowly into amber. The sounds within the saloon dimmed with the changing light, not silenced, only hushed, as though the place itself was catching its breath between the bustle of the morning and the weight of night. Letty stood near the stove, peeling onions by the dimming firelight. The sharp scent stung her eyes, but she welcomed it. It was the smell of supper beginning, of something warm promised after the sun went down. She sliced the onions thin and dropped them into a heavy pot slick with the remains of bacon grease from the midday meal. They hissed and curled, their scent lifting into the air like smoke from a candle's flame. Tonight would be a stew. She began with the salted pork, sliced thin, then cubed, simmered until the fat ran clear. Into the pot she added soaked beans, a handful of chopped onion, bits of dried carrot from the shipment, and 2 sprigs of wild thyme she'd kept drying above the stove for months, waiting for a day like this. The smell deepened quickly, earthy and warm, touched with salt and smoke. It filled every corner of the room. As the stew thickened, she stirred in a spoonful of molasses and a dash of vinegar to cut the richness. Then came the rice, washed, pale and precious. She added it carefully, knowing it would swell and stretch the stew further than beans alone could manage. 12 mouths or more, she thought. Enough for now. Sam returned to the bar just as the first ladleful was poured. His shirt was half-buttoned. His eyes rimmed red from a brief nap, but his voice was clearer than it had been in days. He glanced once at the pot, sniffed the air, and gave Letty a faint nod. That was all she needed. The sun dropped fully below the horizon as the stew reached its peak. Letty ladled it into bowls, thick, hearty, speckled with the bits of pork and softened onion, and laid beside each a wedge of skillet cornbread, browned crisp at the edges, its centre still warm and tender. She had baked 3 pans of it, brushing the tops with the last of the lard before slipping them into the stove's belly. The first to eat were the old men who had lingered through the day, Rafe Delaney, Elias Wheeler and the trapper Malachi. They sat together, more out of habit than friendship, their hands wrapped around warm bowls, their words few. Letty brought them stew, and they nodded in thanks without looking up. More came in as dusk fell. Cowhands returned from the field, spurs jingling, coats dusty. A schoolteacher with ink still smudged on her fingers. A pair of boys with mud on their trousers and hunger in their eyes. Even the preacher came again, his hat pressed to his chest, his coat soaked in evening dew. Letty served them all without pause. The saloon filled with a low, humming warmth. The fire in the stove crackled, the windows glowed with lantern light, and everywhere the scent of stew, deep and rich, the smell of something lasting. Someone started a song at one of the tables, soft, off-key but sweet. Others joined in, hesitantly at first, then with more heart. No instruments, just voices, just the sound of people remembering words they hadn't sung since childhood, words they thought they'd forgotten. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't meant to be. Letty leaned against the doorframe of the kitchen, a dish towel in her hands, and listened. Her fingers ached. Her feet throbbed. But she listened, and she smiled. There were still a few bowls left, enough for the latecomers, for the strangers, for the ones who arrived after the music had begun. She stepped back into the kitchen and cut another wedge of cornbread. The crust crumbled slightly under the knife. She laid it beside a full bowl, steam curling upward like a prayer. Outside, the sky had turned violet. Inside, the saloon was alive again. Not loud, not wild, but full. Full of voices, full of food, full of something that reached deeper than hunger, something older than the trail and softer than the storms. And Letty, with her apron stained and her sleeves rolled high, stood at the centre of it all, quiet, steady, and ready to serve the next plate. As the stars emerged in quiet clusters above the town, the warmth inside the dray burned on, steady and golden. The night had deepened, but the saloon had not emptied. Supper had been served, bowls scraped clean, bread dipped into thick broth until not a drop remained. Yet still they lingered, not just out of hunger now, but because of something rarer, contentment. The stew pot had been emptied not with haste, but reverence. Each ladle had found a home in hands worn from work, each bowl savoured, not devoured. and though the scent of molasses and onions still hovered in the corners, it had faded into memory, one to be carried in the mind long after the belly had been filled. Letty stood in the back, washing the last dishes in a basin of warm water. Her hands were red and rough from heat and soap, but she worked slowly, methodically, the same way she stirred a pot or kneaded dough. She hummed a low tune to herself, barely audible over the creak of the saloon's boards and the wind rattling the shutters. It was the sort of hum meant only for her, steady, familiar, carrying no melody but time. The song at the tables had quieted. The piano had not been played. Tonight needed no music. Instead, the patrons sat in soft conversation, stories exchanged between men who rarely spoke and women who rarely lingered. They talked of weather and cattle, of rivers rising and fences breaking, of childhoods in places with names that no longer mattered. Letty dried the last plate, hung the cloth on a nail beside the stove, and stepped into the saloon proper. The fire had burned low, and she added a few more split logs to coax it back to life. The flames rose slowly, painting the walls in soft gold. The smell of smoke mingled with the lingering scent of stew and the faintest trace of biscuits long since eaten. Sam stood behind the bar, nursing a mug of coffee more for ritual than need. He glanced at her as she passed, gave a slight nod. There was a kind of unspoken understanding between them, a rhythm that required no conversation. She returned the nod and walked to the far table, where Malachi was telling a story to a small group of men who had pulled their chairs close. He was speaking softly, with long pauses, his voice brittle but rich. "Back in '62, he said, running a hand through his beard, "I ate nothing but boiled acorns and pine bark for 2 weeks. Got caught in the mountains with a busted foot and no mule. Thought I'd die up there. Only reason I didn't is because I remembered how my mother used to cook acorn mush when we had no corn." One of the men leaned forward. "Did it taste any good?" Malachi laughed, a sound like dry leaves. No, tasted like tree rot and sorrow, but it filled the belly. They laughed quietly, the kind of laughter that asked nothing more than to be shared. Letty listened, smiling faintly. Stories like that fed the room in ways no stew ever could. They reminded everyone of where they'd been, what they'd endured, and the strange way survival wove itself into memory like a thread through cloth. In the corner, Sadie had curled up on the bench, wrapped in a borrowed quilt, her face tucked into the folds. Letty brought a small tin cup of warm milk, left it on the nearby table just in case she stirred. She adjusted the quilt gently, brushing back a strand of tangled hair from the girl's forehead. The child didn't wake, only sighed, soft and dreamless. Letty straightened, her back aching from the long day, and walked slowly to the porch. The night air met her like a sigh, crisp, cool, full of stars. She leaned on the rail, arms folded, and looked out over the muddy street. The puddles reflected starlight. Somewhere down the road, a dog barked once, then settled. She could still smell the stew on her apron, still feel the flour beneath her nails. Behind her, the saloon breathed like a living thing. Wood creaking, fire crackling, voices murmuring in the dark. It had held them through the cold, the storm, the scarcity. It had become more than a place to eat. It was a place to pause, to breathe, to remember what warmth felt like. Letty stepped back inside, closing the door gently behind her. The latch clicked into place. There would be breakfast to think about soon. She had flour again and coffee, maybe flapjacks, maybe biscuits with fried apples. She had a jar of lard and a sack of cornmeal. The choices weren't endless, but they were enough. She passed through the saloon once more, collecting empty mugs, straightening chairs. A hand touched her arm gently as she reached across one table. It was Alma, still sitting with her doll satchel on the floor. "That was a good meal," she said quietly. Letty nodded. "I'm glad." Then she moved on, returning to the kitchen, the smell of fire and apple butter clinging to her sleeves like old perfume. The stew was gone, but the warmth it brought remained in the walls, in the bellies, in the hush of night that followed. Before the sun rose, while the stars still trembled above the sleeping town, Letty lit the fire once more. She did so without thought now, without ceremony, just as a pianist moves toward keys or a seamstress threads a needle. The fire was her morning prayer. It was her first word spoken to the day, and it answered her with warmth, smoke, and a soft breath of light. The wood caught easily, the kindling dry, and soon the stove filled the kitchen with the low, steady crackle of life returning. Letty stood with her arms folded, watching the flames dance for a moment before turning to the sack of flour now resting beneath the counter. She crouched, ran her hand through it as though to test its mood, then stood and fetched the buttermilk from the back shelf. Cold, still. That was good. This morning it would be flapjacks. Thin, crisp-edged, golden as the dawn to come. The batter came together in a quiet rhythm. Flour, buttermilk, a touch of soda, and eggs from the crate that had finally arrived with the wagon. She cracked two, the yolks bright as setting suns, and mixed until smooth. The pan hissed as the first scoop hit its center. Outside, the town was still asleep. Only the faintest lines of grey showed along the horizon. A wind had picked up sometime in the night, cold and sharp, sweeping across the prairie like a blade. Letty could hear it rattle the shutters, tug at the porch boards. But inside, the warmth had already begun to rise. She flipped the first flapjack with a practiced flick of her wrist. The bottom had browned just right, speckled like parchment, with a crisp ring around the edge. She stacked it on a tin plate, added a second, then a third. A spoonful of apple butter between each layer. No syrup this morning. The molasses was being saved. But the apple butter, spiced and slow-cooked, spread easily across the hot cakes, melting into every crevice. The first to rise was Sam. He stepped into the kitchen with his suspenders half on, rubbing the sleep from his jaw. "Flapjacks?" he asked. Letty handed him the plate without answering. He took it and sat at the bar, his coffee already poured. One by one, the others came down. The preacher in his wrinkled black coat. Two brothers who'd slept in the loft above the store. A woman with wind-burnt cheeks and knuckles still pink from washing. They trickled in with sleep still in their eyes, drawn by the smell of fire, flour and fruit. Letty served them in order, flapjacks warm from the skillet, one plate at a time. She had only the one pan, but she worked quickly, never letting it cool. The kitchen grew hot with it, her face flush from the fire, her fingers dusted in flour. Outside, the sun finally breached the hills, casting long blue shadows over the muddy road. The frost had retreated again, but the ground was still hard beneath the weight of yesterday's cold. Letty could hear the stirrings of horses, the scrape of metal against leather, the thump of boots hitting packed earth. Inside, the saloon brimmed with quiet satisfaction. No one spoke much over breakfast. It was the kind of meal that invited silence, not because it lacked flavour, but because it offered something too tender to speak through. The sweetness of apple butter mingled with the salt of the butter she'd churned herself last month. The crisp edges of each flapjack gave way to a soft centre, and the warmth of the stove filled each breath. At one table, a young man sat sketching something in a journal with a charcoal nub. Letty passed by and glanced down. He was drawing the saloon, or a memory of it. The lanterns hanging low, the stove in the corner. The backs of heads all turned toward plates. She didn't comment, just smiled faintly and moved on. Toward the window, Rafe Delaney sat with his cup half full, staring into the steam as though it held more than just warmth. He'd already eaten, his plate clean but for a crumb or two. His fingers drummed lightly on the wood, not impatient, just thinking. He caught Letty's eye as she passed. "Best flapjacks west of Kansas," he muttered, and she knew from him that meant something. Letty brought him another without being asked. She continued to serve until the batter ran low. Then she scraped the bowl, added a splash more buttermilk, and stretched the last of it into two small cakes. One she gave to Sadie, who had come in late, shivering and half awake. The other she ate herself, standing near the window, watching the frost melt from the grass. It was still early. The day had not yet begun in earnest, but inside the dray it had already offered something full, something quiet, golden, and good. The pan was still hot, the fire still strong, and Letty, though tired, was not weary. Not today. She had fed the morning with her hands, and now it would carry forward, softened by warmth and the memory of flapjacks shared in the hush before the world turned noisy again. By midday, the wind had shifted again, curling in from the north and bringing with it a dry, biting cold that slipped beneath coats and up through boot soles. The sun was high but gave no warmth, casting only a brittle light over the town. Dust rose in small, angry walls across the street. The trough froze at the edges. a thin crust of ice spreading in delicate spiderwebs that cracked under the noses of thirsty horses. Inside the dray, the fire burned lower than usual, but steady. Letty moved through the kitchen like a shadow, sleeves rolled to the elbows, fingers stained with flour and grease. Her hair was tied up in a loose knot, wisps escaping to curl against her cheeks. She had not sat since breakfast. There was no time. Lunch would be less generous than the morning's flapjacks. She needed to make the day stretch, and that meant going back to the roots of what fed hunger best: beans, bread and broth. She started with the beans. Pinto, soaked overnight, cooked low over the fire. They simmered now in a wide pot, flavoured with salt pork, a bit of onion and a splash of molasses. The scent was earthy, almost sweet, and filled the saloon with the familiar comfort of warmth made edible. For bread, she turned to her old standby. Skillet biscuits, not risen tall like the morning's, but thinner, denser, meant for dipping. She shaped them by hand, pressed them flat, and laid them in the skillet to cook on one side, then the other, their surfaces blistering slightly from the heat. They browned quick, hissing in the shallow layer of grease she had saved from the pork. A pot of broth simmered beside the beans, made from bones saved through the week, a few chopped carrots and slivers of onion skin that gave it colour. She didn't strain it. The little flecks of meat and fat floating on the surface were part of the gift. As the scent began to thicken the air, the front doors swung open and in came the lunch crowd. Miners, ranch hands, shopkeepers, all drawn in by habit and hunger. They smelled of cold and leather and dust. Their hands were cracked, their eyes red from wind, but they brought coin and silence and an appreciation born of work. Letty served them in turns. A bowl of beans, a cup of broth, a biscuit on the side. Some asked for coffee, which she poured black and bitter, steam rising like breath from the cracked mugs. Others wanted dandelion tea, steeped strong to chase the cold from their chests. No one asked for more than what they were given. At one table sat a man with a bandaged hand, dirt beneath his nails, his coat worn thin at the elbows. He held his bowl with care, sipping the broth first, then tearing the biscuit into small pieces to soak. Across from him, a boy no older than 16 ate quickly, almost guiltily, as if afraid someone might take it away. Letty noticed both. She poured another helping of beans for the boy without a word, sliding it onto the table as she passed. She left a second biscuit beside the man with the bandaged hand, who looked up and tried to speak. But she was already gone, back to the stove, wiping her hands. Behind the bar, Sam moved slowly, refilling cups and clearing empty plates. He said little, only nodded now and again, his eyes soft beneath the brim of his hat. He kept watch as Letty worked, not out of duty, but out of understanding. She needed the time, and he gave it. By the hearth, the trapper Malachi dozed with his bowl on his knee, the last sip of broth cooling in his cup. A thread of steam still rose from it, catching the light as the fire flickered low. Letty reached over, took the bowl and covered him with a blanket from the hook. The kitchen had grown quiet again. The busiest hour had passed. Only a few bowls remained, a half-pan of beans left warming over the fire. The broth was nearly gone. Letty sat for the first time that day, near the window, her back to the stove. She sipped from a small mug of tea, sweetened faintly with syrup she'd hidden away in the back cabinet. Her feet throbbed, her arms ached. But her stomach was full, and the room was calm. A breeze whistled under the doorframe. Dust swirled across the porch. The saloon creaked like an old ship in dry water, but inside the air was thick with the scent of beans, broth and bread. She closed her eyes just for a moment. Outside the cold gnawed. But here, in this still place, Letty had made warmth from little, as she always had. She had fed them not with bounty, but with memory, with the flavour of something familiar, something honest, something that made the hours between morning and night easier to carry. And as the afternoon rolled on, slow and golden, the saloon held its breath, quiet, fed and waiting for the fire to be stirred again. The wind didn't let up. By late afternoon it had grown sharper, meaner, carving down from the northern hills like a blade honed on stone. Dust hissed across the town, whispering through cracks and crevices, rattling signs, tugging at the saloon's weathered porch boards until the nails creaked. Horses stamped and shifted in their stalls, uneasy. Even the dogs, who normally lounged in the shade beside the post office, had disappeared into warmer corners. But inside the dray, the stove glowed brighter. Letty had fed it with split hickory all morning, and now the heat pulsed steady, comforting, like the low murmur of a lullaby. The scent of beans had faded, replaced now with something sweeter, something new, but still born of what she had on hand. She was baking. Not pies, not cakes. Those needed eggs and butter she no longer had to spare. But she remembered an old recipe from her mother's scrapbook. Molasses cookies, flattened and browned on the edges, soft in the middle. She'd baked them only once before in the dray, months ago, when the weather had turned and the wind howled the same way it did now. She worked quietly, spooning molasses into a bowl with a steady hand, watching its dark, glossy ribbon twist down into the flour, sugar, and lard she'd creamed together with a wooden spoon. She added a dash of cinnamon, a pinch of salt, a whisper of ginger. Then she stirred, slow and careful, until the dough came together like earth after rain, dark, sticky, alive. She rolled it into balls between her palms, placed them on a greased tin sheet, and flattened each gently with her fingers. The stove took them eagerly. The scent of spice and molasses filled the kitchen, slipped into the saloon, settled into the seams of the place like a forgotten memory. One batch came out crisp, another softer. She wrapped the soft ones in cloth and stacked the crisp ones in a tin, setting them on the counter. No price, no sign, just the smell. It didn't take long. The first man to reach for one was a rail worker, hands blistered and bandaged, his eyes dark with fatigue. He bit into the cookie and froze, just for a moment, as if the taste had stopped time. He didn't speak, only nodded once and took another. A woman came in from the cold with her coat buttoned tight and her face half hidden in a scarf. She ordered nothing, only sat by the fire shivering. Letty brought her tea and 2 cookies, laid them gently beside her. The woman's hands hovered above the plate before finally reaching out, slow as snow falling. Letty kept baking. The dough stretched farther than she expected, enough for everyone, even a few extras. She saved those in a small tin behind the counter just in case. Even Sam, quiet and steady Sam, reached for one when he thought she wasn't looking. He took a bite, nodded to himself, then poured a mug of coffee and sat by the window like he did when the wind reminded him of other winters. The saloon stayed busy, not with noise, but presence. People lingered. They played cards more slowly, stirred their drinks more thoughtfully, laughed in half voice. It wasn't the raucous kind of comfort, but the quiet kind, the kind that wrapped around the ribs and said, "You're not alone." Letty stood behind the bar for a time, wiping flour from her hands, watching it all unfold. The fire flickered low, the shadows stretched across the room, and the scent of warm molasses clung to the air like a story being told one sentence at a time. Toward the back, Rafe had fallen asleep in his chair, arms crossed over his chest, a half-eaten cookie still resting on a napkin by his side. Malachi sat nearby, whittling quietly, his boots propped near the hearth, shavings gathering like snow beneath his chair. A mother walked in just before dusk with a baby wrapped tight to her chest and a boy clinging to her skirt. Letty served them each a bowl of broth, a biscuit warmed from the morning, and 2 of the soft cookies, carefully wrapped. The boy's eyes lit up. He didn't say thank you, but he looked at Letty like she was something more than just a cook. She nodded, passed him a third, and sent them to sit by the fire. The wind rattled again outside, pushing harder now, angry that it had no place in the warmth. Letty fed the stove one last time, her hands steady, her breath fogging slightly as she stood near the door. The tin was nearly empty. The cookies were almost gone. But inside, they lingered, in crumbs on the corners of napkins, in the sweet scent still curling along the rafters, in the warmth that no one had to name to feel. And Letty, apron dusted with flour, molasses clinging beneath her nails, stood in the middle of it all, not waiting, not watching, just being, in the quiet of a room that had learned how to hold people long after the food was gone. By the time night arrived in full, the wind had dulled from a scream to a sigh, slow and heavy. It no longer clawed at the shutters or shook the saloon's doors, but it never left entirely. Instead, it curled itself around the building like a cold animal settling down, pressing its weight against every wall, testing every seam. Inside, the warmth held firm. Barely, perhaps, but enough. Letty stayed late by the stove that evening, not out of need, but choice. She wasn't tired yet. Her hands moved slowly over the cooled baking tins, stacking them neatly, folding the flour sack closed. The kitchen, for once, was quiet. There was no boiling, no frying, no grease crackling on iron. Only the slow breath of a fire dying down the faint hum of the saloon beyond the swinging door. Most of the regulars had gone, some upstairs to rented cots, others into the cold, their bellies full and their collars turned high. A few remained, sipping coffee or whiskey, their eyes distant, their shoulders relaxed in a way they rarely allowed during the day. The room had shrunk with the darkness, its corners lost to shadow, its light soft as wool. Letty wiped her hands and stepped out into that hush. The floor creaked beneath her boots. At the far end of the room, Sam was talking low with a man who'd been in town only 2 days, a stranger with a scar along his neck and a drawl that suggested he'd ridden through Arkansas. They weren't discussing much, just weather, cattle, roads, but the rhythm of their voices added to the warmth, like another log on the fire. In the corner, Sadie was asleep again, curled up in the same blanket from before, her feet tucked beneath her. Someone had left a folded jacket beneath her head. Letty didn't know who. She adjusted the quilt around the girl's shoulders, then stood for a moment watching the rise and fall of her small chest. Then, for no reason at all, she walked to the piano. It had sat unused for weeks, its keys dusty, its wood dulled by the breath of 100 fires and 1,000 footsteps. She wiped her hand across the surface, stirred a small cloud of dust and pressed one key. It rang out low and soft, half a tone flatter than it once was. She didn't know how to play, not truly. But her fingers remembered a tune from long ago, a lullaby hummed to her on the rare nights her mother had time to rest. She pressed 3 more keys slowly, then found the beginning of it. Just 4 notes, then 5, then more. The room turned quieter. Sam's voice faded. The whiskey paused mid-sip. Even the wind outside seemed to lean in. Letty played with both hands, slowly, haltingly. Her fingers weren't sure, but the notes were. They wandered down the keys like steps on worn floorboards, finding old places that still knew how to hold sound. The melody wasn't sharp, it wasn't precise, but it was warm. And it was real. The men didn't applaud when she finished. They didn't speak. They just sat for a moment, listening to the last note vanish into the beams overhead. Letty stood from the bench, dusted her palms and returned to the stove without a word. She poured herself a mug of tea, dandelion and mint, and sat at the kitchen doorway, where the fire's glow brushed the toes of her boots. She sipped slowly, watching the room from a distance, the way one watches something they've built but can't quite believe still stands. The piano remained silent, but something had changed. The saloon didn't feel like a place waiting to empty. It felt like one willing to stay awake a little longer, willing to hold its breath and listen. Letty reached into her apron pocket and found a single molasses cookie she'd set aside earlier. She broke it in 2, ate one half slowly and saved the other. Not because she needed it, but because someone else would. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe in the middle of a cold hour when nothing else could fill the space between hunger and sleep. She placed the wrapped half on the back shelf, beside the jars of beans and flour, tucked safely in the dark. Then she banked the fire low, wiped the counter clean, and took one last glance around the room. The wind might rise again, the flour might run low, the work would never stop, but tonight there was still sweetness. And it had lingered, quiet, soft and honest, in every corner of the dray. The next morning arrived quietly, as though the night had not entirely left. The sky was overcast, painted in pale muted shades of blue and grey, with no promise of sun. A thin frost clung to the window panes, delicate and fleeting, already beginning to melt where the stove's warmth reached. Outside, the street was silent. No boots echoed, no wagon wheels creaked. Only the distant sound of crows rose over the prairie, sharp, quick, then gone. Inside the dray, Letty moved more slowly than usual. Her joints ached from the cold, and her arms were sore from stirring, lifting, baking. But she didn't mind. It was the ache of having fed people, and there was a kind of peace in that. She lit the fire, as always, using bark peeled from the woodpile and the soft remains of last night's newspapers. The kindling caught easily. The logs followed. Heat crawled back into the kitchen by degrees, stretching into her fingers, softening her movements. Today's breakfast would be simple. A pot of cornmeal mush, cooked low and long until thick enough to hold its shape on a spoon. Letty stirred it in silence, adding a pinch of salt and a trickle of milk. No one expected extravagance on a morning like this. They expected something hot, something steady. She opened the small tin where she'd hidden the half-cookie. It was still there, wrapped in cloth, soft and fragrant. She thought of giving it to Sadie, but the girl hadn't come yet. Perhaps later. As the mush thickened, Letty began frying slices of salt pork, thin this time, crisp to the edges, each one laid carefully on a cloth to drain. The grease she saved, as always, poured off into a small stone jar. Nothing was wasted. Not in a place like this. By 7, Sam had come down the stairs, rubbing at his eyes and yawning through his beard. He poured himself a mug of coffee without a word and sat at the bar, watching the steam curl from the pot. "Feels like snow," he said at last. Letty didn't answer. She just nodded and stirred the mush. The first customer was a teacher, Miss Brenner, who had arrived wrapped in a long grey shawl, her cheeks pink from the walk. She sat near the stove, hands cupped around a tin mug, eyes already closing before the tea had cooled. Letty brought her a bowl, cornmeal mush with a spoonful of molasses and a crisp slice of pork on the side. The teacher looked at the plate as if it were a letter from home. The others came slowly, drawn in by the fire's warmth and the quiet rhythm of the room. Rafe Delaney. The 2 brothers from the livery, the boy who delivered telegrams on foot. One by one they sat, ate and stayed. No one left quickly. No one spoke loudly. Even the clinking of spoons against tin bowls seemed softened by the hush of the morning. Letty served each in turn, careful with her portions. The mush went far, and the pork added just enough bite to warm the mouth. For those who looked especially weary, she added a bit of dried apple, stewed soft and sweet. A reminder that even in lean seasons, small joys could still be found. Sadie arrived just after 8. Her braid was crooked, her boots untied. She looked tired in the way children rarely do, more from the world than from sleep. Letty set a bowl down for her at the end of the bar, then handed her the wrapped cookie. Sadie unwrapped it slowly, like something sacred. She didn't speak. She just held it for a long moment, then took a single bite and closed her eyes. Outside, the first flakes began to fall, light, slow, drifting like dust from a broken ceiling. They stuck to the porch rail, the windows, the edges of saddles left beneath the eaves. No one commented, but heads turned toward the windows all the same. Letty moved back to the stove, refilled the pot with more water, more cornmeal, stirred again. Her hands found the rhythm without effort. They had been doing this for too long not to know the way. By the time the sun reached its highest point behind the clouds, the saloon had filled again. Not with noise, not with music, but with warmth. With the sound of breath and spoons and footsteps softened by hunger's end. Letty stood by the doorway of the kitchen, watching them as she sipped a mug of tea. The fire was low but steady. The bowls were emptying, and the snow outside whispered promises no one could yet understand. But the food was real. The warmth was lasting. And for one more day, in a town that forgot too much, something was remembered. Through cornmeal and crisp pork and the sweetness of molasses on a winter's tongue. By late afternoon, the snow had thickened. What began as a whisper now fell in silence so complete it seemed to hush the very breath of the town. Flakes gathered on windowsills and rooftops, piled along fence posts, softened the angles of wagons left idle beneath canvas. Horses stood still beneath the overhangs, their ears flicking, their muzzles dusted white. Inside the dray, the world had narrowed to a smaller, warmer shape. The fire had been fed 3 times since dawn. Letty moved between stove and pantry in a quiet rhythm, her breath visible in the cold corners near the back wall. Her apron had darkened with flour and steam, her sleeves damp to the elbows. Her hands, red from heat and water, kept moving without rest. For supper, she would make dumplings. Not the fluffy, rounded ones her mother used to float on top of stew, but flat, wide ribbons of dough cut thin and boiled in broth. They took little to make, just flour, salt and water, rolled out on a floured board and sliced with a dull knife. Letty mixed them by feel, the dough stiff and cool beneath her palms. The broth had been simmering since midday, bones from last week's ham, carrots diced fine, onion and a bit of the pepper Sam had brought back from his trip south last spring. She poured the dumplings into the pot 1 handful at a time, letting them slip beneath the surface. The scent rose quickly, rich, savoury, heavy with warmth. It filled the saloon like music. Men came in brushing snow from their shoulders, muttering softly, boots dripping onto the floor. Women followed with cheeks flushed red, scarves wrapped tight, fingers pulled from gloves to cradle mugs. Even the dogs slunk in when the door cracked open, then curled up near the stove, too tired to beg, too wise to leave. Letty served the first bowl to the preacher, who had helped shovel the walkway that morning without being asked. He murmured a blessing over the steam before taking his first bite, eyes closing as he chewed. His lips moved again, but this time no one heard the words. She served the next to Malachi, who had come in late, his boots caked in snow, his beard sparkling with ice. He didn't remove his coat, just sat by the fire and held the bowl close, letting the steam rise into his face like medicine. Then came the rest. The dumplings stretched farther than she expected. She added a bit more water, another pinch of salt, another splash of broth. They thickened the pot like good news. The room grew warmer, fuller, slower. Conversation came in waves, low and steady. No laughter, not tonight. Only the comfort of food and the quiet press of shared weather. Sam wiped down the bar in slow circles, his eyes drifting now and then toward the snow outside. "You ever seen it come this early?" he asked. Letty shook her head. "Not like this." He poured her a mug of coffee, handed it over without a word. Letty sipped it slowly, watching the dumplings puff and settle in the pot. Toward the back, Sadie played with a strip of cloth, tying it into knots and undoing them again. Letty brought her a half bowl filled with broth and soft carrots and a piece of cornbread saved from the morning. The girl ate with her head down, slow and focused. When she finished, she didn't ask for more. She just slid the bowl forward and folded her hands. Letty placed a single dumpling in the empty dish and walked away. As night settled, the windows turned black. The wind had stopped, leaving only the sound of snow falling soft on the roof, like flour sifted onto stone. No one wanted to leave. A few laid coin on the bar but made no move toward the door. They sat in chairs turned toward the fire, their hands resting on their laps, their bellies quiet. They looked not like men in a saloon, but travellers waiting out a storm in a place they trusted not to vanish overnight. Letty leaned back against the kitchen doorframe, her eyes heavy but open, her chest full but not with words. She didn't need to speak. The food had said everything already. In the quiet of that snow-draped night, the dray became more than it had been. It became shelter. It became memory. It became the echo of something old and essential, the knowledge that in a cold world, a hot bowl, a soft dumpling, a place to sit could still make the difference between feeling lost and being found. By late afternoon, the snow had thickened. What began as a whisper now fell in silence, so complete it seemed to hush the very breath of the town. Flakes gathered on windowsills and rooftops, piled along fence posts, softened the angles of wagons left idle beneath canvas. Horses stood still beneath the overhangs, their ears flicking, their muzzles dusted white. Inside the dray, the world had narrowed to a smaller, warmer shape. The fire had been fed 3 times since dawn. Letty moved between stove and pantry in a quiet rhythm, her breath visible in the cold corners near the back wall. Her apron had darkened with flour and steam, her sleeves damp to the elbows. Her hands, red from heat and water, kept moving without rest. For supper, she would make dumplings. Not the fluffy, rounded ones her mother used to float on top of stew, but flat, wide ribbons of dough cut thin and boiled in broth. They took little to make, just flour, salt and water, rolled out on a floured board and sliced with a dull knife. Letty mixed them by feel, the dough stiff and cool beneath her palms. The broth had been simmering since midday, bones from last week's ham, carrots diced fine, onion and a bit of the pepper Sam had brought back from his trip south last spring. She poured the dumplings into the pot one handful at a time, letting them slip beneath the surface. The scent rose quickly, rich, savoury, heavy with warmth. It filled the saloon like music. Men came in brushing snow from their shoulders, muttering softly, boots dripping onto the floor. Women followed with cheeks flushed red, scarves wrapped tight, fingers pulled from gloves to cradle mugs. Even the dogs slunk in when the door cracked open, then curled up near the stove, too tired to beg, too wise to leave. Letty served the first bowl to the preacher, who had helped shovel the walkway that morning without being asked. He murmured a blessing over the steam before taking his first bite, eyes closing as he chewed. His lips moved again, but this time no one heard the words. She served the next to Malachi, who had come in late, his boots caked in snow, his beard sparkling with ice. He didn't remove his coat, just sat by the fire and held the bowl close, letting the steam rise into his face like medicine. Then came the rest. The dumplings stretched farther than she expected. She added a bit more water, another pinch of salt, another splash of broth. They thickened the pot like good news. The room grew warmer, fuller, slower. Conversation came in waves, low and steady. No laughter, not tonight. Only the comfort of food and the quiet press of shared weather. Sam wiped down the bar in slow circles, his eyes drifting now and then toward the snow outside. "You ever seen it come this early?" he asked. Letty shook her head. "Not like this." He poured her a mug of coffee, handed it over without a word. Letty sipped it slowly, watching the dumplings puff and settle in the pot. Toward the back, Sadie played with a strip of cloth, tying it into knots and undoing them again. Letty brought her a half bowl, filled with broth and soft carrots, and a piece of cornbread saved from the morning. The girl ate with her head down, slow and focused. When she finished, she didn't ask for more. She just slid the bowl forward and folded her hands. Letty placed a single dumpling in the empty dish and walked away. As night settled, the windows turned black. The wind had stopped, leaving only the sound of snow falling soft on the roof, like flour sifted onto stone. No one wanted to leave. A few laid coin on the bar but made no move toward the door. They sat in chairs turned toward the fire, their hands resting on their laps, their bellies quiet. They looked not like men in a saloon, but travellers waiting out a storm in a place they trusted not to vanish overnight. Letty leaned back against the kitchen doorframe, her eyes heavy but open, her chest full but not with words. She didn't need to speak. The food had said everything already. In the quiet of that snow-draped night, the dray became more than it had been. It became shelter. It became memory. It became the echo of something old and essential. The knowledge that in a cold world, a hot bowl, a soft dumpling, a place to sit, could still make the difference between feeling lost and being found. The snow continued through the night, relentless yet gentle, settling into every hollow and seam of the town until it seemed the world had forgotten to move. Morning rose in silence. There were no bird song, no distant hammers, no wheels creaking along frozen tracks. Only the whisper of falling flakes, soft as ash, drifting from a sky gone colourless. Inside the dray it was still warm. Letty had been awake since before light, rubbing life into her fingers and breathing steam from the tin kettle she kept close to the fire. She hadn't slept much, too many thoughts, too many lists in her head, ticking through supplies and scraps, mapping out meals for days that might stretch thinner than planned. But she had a plan for today. Rice. She had enough to make something sweet. She lit the stove with careful hands and fetched the sack from the pantry. A little less than a pound left. She measured slowly, cooking it in milk, not water. Precious, yes, but necessary. The milk warmed slowly, cradling the rice as it swelled and softened. She added cinnamon from the spice jar, the last shavings scraped from the tin, and stirred gently, never letting it boil. When the rice thickened, she added a spoonful of dried apple, finely chopped, and a touch of sugar from the small jar she kept hidden behind the flour. The scent of it filled the kitchen, creamy, warm, laced with the ghost of orchards and forgotten autumns. She tasted it once, then covered the pot and let it rest by the fire. Sam came down an hour later, wrapped in a wool coat, his breath curling in the air. He said nothing, only poured a cup of coffee and leaned near the stove, nodding toward the pot. "Rice pudding?" he asked after a moment. Letty nodded. He took a deep breath, smiled faintly. Good choice. By the time the first bowl was served, the sun had climbed high enough to cast soft silver light through the windows. Outside, the town was buried. Doors had to be pushed open against the drift. Footprints vanished within minutes, but they came anyway. First Sadie, cheeks pink, her arms wrapped tight around herself. Letty gave her a small bowl, no spoon, just a crust of bread to scoop it with. The girl sat on the floor near the stove, knees tucked beneath her, and ate with quiet reverence. Then came the preacher again, this time with a woman from the church who'd lost her roof to the weight of the snow. They took seats near the hearth, steam rising from their bowls like incense. The rice stretched well, better than expected. Letty thinned it with more milk, added another pinch of sugar, spooned the last of the stewed apple into the pot. She served it to each who entered. Miners, shopkeepers, a young mother with a baby strapped to her chest and exhaustion clinging to her shoulders like a second coat. No one expected sweetness. No one asked for it. But they all looked surprised when it came. Letty didn't speak much. She kept stirring, kept filling bowls, kept wiping the edges with the clean corner of her apron before handing them over. The fire crackled, the steam rose, and the smell of cinnamon and apple lingered like a memory just out of reach. A man with frostbitten fingers sat near the door. He didn't ask for anything, only thawed slowly, watching the room as though unsure if he belonged in it. Letty brought him a bowl and a thick piece of bread. He took them both with both hands, eyes wide. "It's sweet," he said after the first bite. Letty only nodded. Near the window, Malachi had taken up his whittling again, carving small notches into what looked like a branch from the cottonwood outside. He didn't eat at first, but when the rice reached him, he set the knife down and ate silently, one spoonful at a time, like a man remembering something he hadn't dared to feel in years. Outside, the snow began to slow, not stop, but soften. Letty stood by the stove with a nearly empty pot, her hands resting on the lid. The kitchen smelled like kindness, like patience, like something sacred, though no one would name it that. She dipped the ladle one last time, poured the final serving into a chipped bowl and set it on the counter. For herself, or for whoever walked through the door next, it didn't matter. The fire glowed low. The saloon had quieted again, bellies full, eyes softer. The world outside was still buried, but inside the dray, sweetness had taken root, in rice and milk and apple and memory, and for now, that was enough. The snow held for 2 more days. It blanketed everything in a silence that no voice dared disturb. Chimneys smoked across the rooftops like slow breath rising from slumbering beasts. The church bell didn't ring. The telegraph office stayed closed. A lantern in the general store window burned around the clock, but the door never opened. The town had entered a kind of shared stillness, a truce between hardship and the deeper cold outside. Inside the dray, life became slower, closer, more hushed. Letty kept the fire alive day and night. She rose before dawn, warmed her hands over the coals, and planned each meal like a prayer. There were no deliveries. No wagons could pass. Everything she cooked came from the store of dried goods in the pantry and the dwindling jars she'd put by herself in better months. For the 3rd morning of snow, she made hominy. It was the last of the sack, pearled corn, soaked overnight, rinsed and boiled until it bloomed soft and fragrant. She added bacon grease, the last of it, and stirred in a spoonful of blackstrap molasses for strength. The result was thick, golden, and rich with the taste of preservation. She didn't need to call anyone. The scent filled the saloon before the sun rose. Sam came first, carrying an armful of split logs and stamping snow from his boots. He sniffed the air, smiled without showing teeth, and laid the wood beside the stove before pouring himself a mug of coffee. Letty served him a bowl without asking. He ate it slowly, his eyes watching the flames. Then came the others. A line of boot tracks marked the saloon floor, one set after another, trailing snow and silence. No one lingered on the porch. They entered with their heads bowed, shaking off coats and frost, drawn not by hunger alone, but by the glow of fire and the promise of something hot in the bowl. Letty served the hominy in ironstone cups, thick and steady. She placed a slice of fried bread on the side, browned in lard and speckled with salt. Some asked for coffee. Others just sat and ate, not speaking, not looking up. The food required their full attention, their full gratitude. In the far corner, a group of railroad men shared a table, each with red-rimmed eyes and cracked hands. One of them, a younger fellow with his collar pulled high, paused with his spoon halfway to his mouth and said softly, "Tastes like something my grandmother made once, in the Ozarks, long time back." No one replied. But the others nodded, each in their own silence. Letty moved through the room like smoke, filling mugs, laying down plates, adding wood to the fire. She had no time for idleness, but she paused when needed, when someone looked too tired to lift their spoon, when a bowl had been pushed aside still half full. She knew the difference between full and defeated. Sadie came late that morning. She stood just inside the door, dripping snow onto the floor, her cheeks raw with cold. Letty took her hand, led her to the stool near the stove, and wrapped her in a wool blanket. Then she brought her the last cup of hominy and the smallest spoon they had. The girl didn't eat at first. She just stared into the fire, holding the spoon in both hands like it might vanish. Letty crouched beside her. "It's hot," she whispered, "and it's yours." Sadie blinked. Then she nodded and took her first bite. Later, as the day passed and the sky lightened just enough to show movement beyond the snowfall, Letty stepped outside. The wind had gone. The air was sharp, dry and still. Snow clung to every surface, soft, gleaming, impossibly quiet. Her breath rose in a silver plume, fading into the pale blue beyond the rooftops. She stood there a long moment, arms crossed, eyes scanning the horizon. There was no sign of travel, no fresh tracks down the road. The snow had erased everything but memory. Behind her, the saloon still breathed, murmurs, footsteps, the creak of chairs, the slow clink of spoons in empty bowls. She stepped back in, shaking snow from her shoulders. The pot was nearly empty, the bread gone. But the room was full of warmth, full of stories unsaid, full of people who had nowhere else to go, and nothing else to do but wait out the snow together. Letty banked the fire again and returned to the kitchen. Tonight she would make something simple, perhaps boiled oats with dried apples, perhaps soup from bones and ends. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the stove still burned, that the bowls, though chipped and mismatched, were filled, that no one sat alone, and that in a town smothered by snow and silence, the dray still held a heartbeat, steady, warm and full of flavour. The snow began to melt on the fourth day. Not all at once, and not with fanfare, but slowly, almost shyly, as if the sky itself was uncertain whether it could trust the thaw. The ice on the trough cracked first, splintering in delicate spiderwebs before giving way to a thin, grey sheen of water. Icicles shrank, drop by drop, from the eaves. Patches of brown earth peeked through the white in quiet corners, near fence posts and the base of wagon wheels. Inside the dray, the air was thick with steam and warmth. The stove had not gone cold in days, and the walls held the scent of smoke and broth like a second skin. Letty stood by the window, her hand resting on the sill, watching the snow drip from the roof. Her apron was damp at the hem, her hands dusted with flour. She had already kneaded dough twice that morning, once for biscuits, once for the dumplings she would float in tonight's soup. The meat was already simmering on the stove, bones and all, sending up curls of rich aroma that clung to the rafters and seeped into the boards. Sam was mending a chair near the fire, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, a nail between his teeth and a hammer in his hand. He glanced up at Letty now and then, saying nothing, simply watching her watch the world change. The saloon was quiet but not empty. A few men slept near the stove, their boots off, their feet wrapped in rags. 2 women sat at a table near the back, knitting slowly, their fingers moving in sync, their eyes fixed on the same distant thought. The preacher was reading from a small book in the corner, mouthing the words, though no one could hear them. Letty turned from the window at last, wiping her hands on her apron, and moved to the stove. She stirred the soup once, long, slow circles, then tasted it. The broth was rich, the carrots soft, the pepper just right. She added the dumplings in handfuls, watching them sink, then rise again like soft coins tossed into a deep well. Each one thickened the soup, made it feel like something solid, something generous. By noon, the tables were full again. The snowmelt had coaxed people out from their homes, had turned the quiet town into a slow-moving current of footsteps and voices. They came in brushing water from their coats, their hats damp, their cheeks pink with thaw. Some were laughing, some were silent. All were hungry. Letty served bowl after bowl. Soup and biscuits, hot coffee, apple slices warmed in syrup from the jar she'd opened for comfort. There was no ceremony, just the clink of tin, the hush of spoons meeting mouths, the low murmur of life returning. A boy of 9 or 10 came in barefoot, his toes red and raw. Letty wrapped his feet in an old quilt and set him near the fire. She gave him a bowl of soup and a piece of bread spread with apple butter. He didn't speak, he just ate. Near the bar, a man with snowmelt dripping from his hat lifted his bowl to his lips and drank the last of the broth with his eyes closed. When he opened them again, he looked around the room like it was the first time he'd truly seen it. Then he stood, left a coin on the counter and stepped back into the melting world. By late afternoon, the snow on the roof was gone. Puddles formed outside the door, tracking mud across the floor. Letty didn't mind. She swept them up in slow arcs, her broom wet but steady. The soup pot was empty by dusk, the biscuits all gone, the syrup jar scraped clean. Letty sat by the stove for the first time in hours, a cup of tea in her hands, her back resting against the warm iron. Her bones ached, her feet throbbed, but her heart was quiet. Sam brought her a blanket and draped it over her shoulders. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The saloon glowed with lantern light. The stove cracked softly. Outside, the last of the snow melt whispered into the ground, and inside everything held bowls, fire, memory, and the long breath of a winter survived.